heard that. Meetings being recorded. Got it. So again, I'm going to put this up on YouTube or one of my older versions of it so you guys can get ready for the test. We're going to cover a lot of stuff tonight. Some of it's in the book, some of it's out in the field. I want to make sure you're ready to pass the test, but I'm also, it's my goal to make sure you're ready to be a good broker. I think my success is when former students call me. I got 2 calls today, in fact, from former students with questions and stuff. Now, obviously, it may not be a big deal. If I could just help them out on small things, I'll do that where I can. So, yeah, generally, our goal here is going to be, hold on for a second. Again, you guys know me already, Brian Winter, skyscraperfoundry@gmail.com is my email. At the end of the night, you're going to send emails to the school, as you probably know already. But in the interim, you're also going to
Yeah, we are there.
Okay, but as we come in, again, if anybody has questions at any time, feel free to mute mic off and mic on and ask me some questions. Very quickly, this is who I am. I'm an architect and a broker. RA means registered architect, MBA means blithering idiot. It's a reminder, though, that while this is a 75-hour class, this is in fact, all this content is wrapped up into my MBA classes that I've given here and in China. Because in fact, a lot of the real estate market is in fact the largest single asset class in the world. Yes, it's bigger. The Chinese market is bigger than the stock market. And actually the way the United States stock market's dropping, although I didn't get the numbers for today, it's going to be a race to the bottom as to which one falls faster, real estate or stocks. Again, very quickly, from the bottom, designed banks for Citibank around the world, designed skyscrapers, work with Deutsche Bank, which may disappear next week if you're following Wall Street. Very interesting there. But probably most importantly, while I was at Deutsche Bank, I had a lot of clients before that, shall we say, were security clients. But with Deutsche Bank, we had 9/11, and I decided to do some public service with that. Between hotel design, they asked me to come to New York City Department of Buildings. Commissioner called me up and said, Brian, we got to collapse every day. You got to come back. Well, so I spent 5 years as a deputy commissioner for the Department of Buildings in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Manhattan. So I have seen everything you could ever dream of. I've approved skyscrapers. I helped design skyscrapers. And sadly, I've seen what happens when they collapse as well. After that, I negotiated against 70,000 labor union members as the head of the Cement League. And then again, I've been teaching and consulting for the last 10 years, and it's fun. And one thing you never know is you're never bored. And that's what I'm really excited about. So that's me. Again, one of the things, my key theme for tonight is the sacred and the profane, not in a theological standpoint, but in the sense that real estate construction and the environment are about wonderful things. Clean environments versus filthy environments. Beautiful, fantastic buildings versus terrible disasters. All of them are part of being a real estate broker and or a salesperson. You have to understand that what you do has an impact on people's lives, and that is also why you're getting a state license. Quick reminder, of course, the outline of the class, which is the M1 to 20. Tonight is M12, of course, but this is a mini MBA, and I teach it at the level of my MBA classes. I don't talk down to you. I treat you as equal professionals. I talk to you just like my clients. So if I'm a little rude and tough, get over it. You're in the wrong business. The bottom line is I want you to be ready to do a good job in not only the New York, but an international market. Obviously, New York City is in a very roller coaster ride the last couple of years. And I've seen a lot of people make a lot of money and seen a lot of people get crushed. So ups and downs, and very interesting to what's coming. So again, little outline. M12 is tonight's class, of course, construction and the environment, and in chapter 11. So hopefully you'll be following along on chapter 11. Oh, start off with our good old attendance. Is anybody's first night tonight? If this is your first night, at the end, New York State requires us to take online attendance. To do so, I'm noting who's in the participant page along the way. 1, 2, at the end of the night, the school requires you to send your email you're going to send an email at the end of the night to slcconference@verizon.net. That's the school's email. And you're going to put the 3 codes that I give you during the night tonight. The first code is M12. That's the name of the class. D. Okay. M12D is code number 1. You'll get 3 codes during class. At the end of the night, you're going to send it off to here. And up here, most importantly, to help me make my life easier, I also want you to put your name in the Zoom chat. Many of you have done this before. Please put your name and your school number. So for instance, Brian Winter, again, you're going to send this email at the end of the night, but in chat right now, put your name and your school code so I can make sure you get credit for the entire class. Okay, a lot of people drift in late. It'll be up to them. I will tell you that you are in the center of the world. I have traveled to many places on many continents, and every one of them, they all look and say, you go to every one of them, every one of the places. There's a New York deli, there's a New York business school, there's a New York language school. New York City is a brand. It's a tarnished brand and clearly a damaged brand right now, but it is a powerful brand. And that is why people don't pay, you want to be suburban Dallas, fine. You'll pay about $250 a square foot to get a beautiful house, and you'll get 3 cars, and you'll have to drive everywhere and pay $7 for gas. Or you can be next to my office on 57th Street, or that tower I showed you a minute ago that I helped design. And instead of $250 a square foot, you'll be paying $3, $5, $10, $15,000. Yes, I said that right. $15,000 per square foot. For all of you, I used to do this RMB equivalent. That's 100,000 RMB per square meter. For all of you, no. Yeah, that's no, 1 million RMB per square meter. It's times 70. Anyway, who cares? Big point is that we are dealing with an amazing time, and you've got to make the best of it. You've also got to get out there and kick some butt. If you are watching more than 10 minutes of television a day, you're in the wrong business. Okay? You need to get out and hustle, see the city, walk around. I just dealt with a client today, 3 different sites. Yesterday, he called me and I was like, well, what do you think about this? And I said, well, I just walked past that place in Chinatown this weekend, and I know exactly that area well. And he was very impressed, and it helped. And then he goes to another building out in Greenpoint. Well, surprise, surprise, I had walked past that building about 2 months ago. The point is, you got to know the city. Your most powerful weapon, what's your most powerful weapon in New York City? Your feet. A true New Yorker secretly believes that people living anywhere else have to be, in some sense, kidding. Whether it stays that way or not remains to be seen. But for the last 80 years, this has been the capital of the world. Whether it stays, your being here may be a function of that class. Again, student intros. Anybody want to introduce yourselves? We've got a small class tonight. Anybody want a mic on? I usually ask for your name, your neighborhood, and a real estate fact. Once, twice. Again, I'll go first. Brian Winter. I live in Regal Park, Queens. One observation, it's a very hot area for residential construction. New apartment construction is underway despite 2020, 2021. Now, it's very transit centered with somewhat limited cars. Now, a lot of people have cars and they hate it out here. I gave up. I said, forget it. I'm not going to bother with a car. I use the subway or Uber or a jet. And that's the way I get around. So the point is, broadly, we are in an urban environment. What's going to make you work? Does anybody want to introduce yourself to the class? Once, twice. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. Quick reminder, the state very frequently issues, you're going to take this class, but along the way, you're going to have other things that have to be done. The state will come up with new laws relatively frequently, and your broker has to communicate them to you. The Secretary of State's job overseeing the Department of State in New York State, not coincidentally, I believe he's now about to become I think he is already since April, he's been made the lieutenant governor. We'll see what happens in the politics, who knows, in the election. The big picture is, this was an example of an update that they put out. Yes, you'll get this in your next training, but in real time, they make updates. Your broker is going to relay to you. This one was about the broker having to put online on his or her website, right up front, these are the conditions for when a person wants to look at a house. It was accused that people were doing discrimination. For instance, you might have your friend and they say, oh, don't worry, you come look at it anytime and make your offers. We don't care. And then maybe somebody who wasn't new to the neighborhood, they would say, you know something, you can't look at the property until I have, full proof of funds, blah, blah, blah. And so now the broker has to make a statement online to that effect. And again, the goal is no discrimination, no favoritism. And don't forget it, again, as a broker, I always said racism is a very bad economic decision. When you choose against somebody because of the color of their skin, black, white, yellow, orange, God knows what, or green, if you saw that on the subway last night, we are in an environment where if you discriminate against people, you're actually reducing potential clients, and therefore it's a bad business. So as we go on, a quick reminder of the classes, the main brokers class, we think about the nature of, some of you may be doing continuing education. And as you see some of the examples of the subject matters that are in both the brokers class or the salespersons class, you guys are always going to be learning. That is an absolute brutal fact, okay? Get used to it. You're going to constantly, not only continuing education crap, but you're going to be out there trying to pick up and get ideas, but at the same time, you're going to be learning your market. Because remember, this is very important. Zillow wants to kick your butt. And I've been saying for years, they're not invincible. A lot of brokers said, oh, Zillow knows everything. They have all the data. But as a famous American titan of business years ago, he said, as he sat on the back of his yacht with his boyfriend, he said, with all thy getting, get thee wisdom. Malcolm Forbes. The point is that you need to be always trying to get new perspectives, new whatever, make it happen. I don't need wisdom. I just get smacked in the head by my wife once in a while. Much easier. Of course, housing starts. If you are not paying attention to the marketplace, you are out of your mind. The housing starts are starting to drop off big time. Well, housing sales have epically dropped in Q3, and the September numbers are starting to come out soon, and it looks like it's going to be a bloodbath. A lot of sales not happening, but that's okay. You're playing the long game. I've dealt with developers where we designed a property in 1998. It didn't get built till 2015. And the difference was he got 10,000 a square foot for it. So I guess that works out. In fact, you're playing the long game with real estate. One of the most important things is the red line, which is in fact for basically the last 10 years beyond this chart, really since 2007, we were building less units than we're falling apart. It's definitely less than we're needed. As we bring millions of people in per year and general population growth happens, we can't have a shrinking housing stock. And obviously that creates a lot of pressure. And some would say that, if we bring lots of people in, then a lot of the people are going to get displaced, and it's not a good picture. But that's some of the balance of housing starts. We think about the fact that only recently have we built more than we lost, the red line being the million-ish per year buildings that literally fall down. And as I said, I was a building commissioner for the Department of Buildings, deputy for Brooklyn. I had to order a lot of buildings demolished. They were just falling apart. I was just looking at one today in downtown Brooklyn, and we demolished it halfway, and somebody stepped in and fixed it. I was pretty impressed with them. And I called him to say thanked him for fixing the building. But in fact, not only was it a landmark building, it was 12 units of apartments. And again, it's an example of how buildings literally fall down. Again, that building was 1869. Things don't go well. What else do we see? Again, restart. This is a very important chart. This goes through June, July. Unfortunately, it's not much better. As of today, I believe we're up at 46%. What are we looking at? We're looking at office use. The office buildings in New York City are sitting empty. I'm actually going to be doing a YouTube class talking about how we can convert old office buildings and old medical buildings in some cases to residential, where we have, as you can see here, NBA, yeah, people going there, no problem. TSA, people are flying, people are going to tape, eating, but not a lot of people are going to the office. That change is fundamental. An article today said New York City may lose $450 billion in real estate value for the commercial brokers, the commercial properties in the next 2 years as we see things change. So again, these are things we want to think about. Again, pending home sales went way up. They started to come down in 2021. They went way up again in 2020, up until March 2022, and now they're cratering again. Home ownership is another interesting thing to think about. By the way, this is Fred. Anybody know what Fred is? Fred is actually the Federal Reserve. This is data directly from the United States Federal Reserve and the Census Bureau. And what it shows actually in this case is over time, this is home ownership. In fact, we see home ownership increase 2006, but then a lot of people were given houses they couldn't afford. In fact, in many cities today, several banks just announced, if you are of a particular ethnic group or several ethnic groups, you can, not me, you can get free mortgages, no money down, no closing costs, and they'll put you in a house. Again, very interesting perspective on targeting. We'll see how it works out for them. Quick reminder of New York State population density. As we think about the New York City, is anybody in the class outside of New York City proper? I frequently get people from Syracuse and had quite a few people from upstate in the class. Anyway, big picture is the density, of course, New York City is high, but outside the state, outside of Manhattan, the 50-mile radius of New York City, we see this string of pearls. And this string of pearls is, of course, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, Albany. And these cities were in the 19th and early 20th centuries, this was Silicon Valley. These were incredibly powerful companies. And now they're gone. I mean, these cities, powerful cities. And the businesses are all gone and these cities are dying. If you don't believe me, go on Zillow and search Syracuse, New York for properties under $50,000. You'll come up with dozens, if not hundreds of properties. And you'll see the same with Buffalo, Syracuse, et cetera. This is a reminder that markets aren't always great. In fact, 20 years ago, Brooklyn was hell. Brooklyn, Williamsburg, Brooklyn, the artsy-fartsy capital today, was empty, abandoned warehouses, and it was a shell. You could buy properties for $20 a square foot, and of course, general rent is $10 a square foot, and now they're worth $2,000, $3,000 a square foot. It's amazing what's happened in the market. We don't know where it'll go in the future, but never forget this one thing, and this makes you better than Zillow. And Zillow, by the way, had its you-know-what handed to it this year because they tried to use computer algorithms to buy properties automatically. The company almost failed. They almost were wiped out because of how bad the computer tried to pick properties. That's a reminder to you that you've got to be smarter than the computer. And guess what? You can be. So think about that. Again, another thing coming up, actually, if anybody's interested, the home inspection class is coming. John is teaching it now. I may start in a couple of weeks. I got to see what we're doing with that. These are a very interesting group that they've been really blasted the last couple of years. Home inspectors try to help advise a buyer on the condition of a building. Very often buildings can have hidden damage, and getting a home inspection could be very important. Now, in the last couple of years, people have been buying with no contingencies. They were like, I don't care. I'm not going to look. I need a place. Buy it now, sign, sight unseen. Especially upstate, this was dangerous because people were buying 150, 200-year-old houses that were literally, termite farms. And a lot of people lost some money on that. But, some people did well. What they didn't do is they didn't get home inspections because there would be, 20 offers on a house and you had to move fast. As a broker, if you're doing buyer's broker, you have to navigate that. If you're a seller's broker, you have to manage the flow of offers. It was only a year ago that if you put a house on the market, within hours, you would have 20 offers on the property. And I know one property in Maryland had 99 offers in one day. Again, this is something to think about as we look at the market and this person, the home inspectors look at the building systems, which we're going to look at a little tonight, but every one of these subjects tonight is like an 8-hour class in the home inspection. So think about that as these are the people that help the buyer to advise. And if you're working as for the buyer, it's very risky to not get a home inspector these days. And conversely, if you're working for the seller, don't tell them not to get one, because if you say anything like that, you could be potentially in trouble. Again, this was a home inspection up in Connecticut, for instance, or Massachusetts. The house was actually rigged to explode. Luckily, the home inspector was smart enough to be able to pick it up. Again, that particular class, it's about 100 hours of class and 40 hours of field work. And then after that field work, you pass the state test and you are licensed as a broker. Now, excuse me, as a home inspector, unlike a real estate salesperson, where you have to work for years under a broker. Home inspection's typical issues are very similar to the typical issues we'll talk about tonight: structure, foundations, the wood, termites, basements, crawl spaces. I'll get to all this tonight. Most of this, a little more detail is covered in the home inspection class. So again, another important person in the equation is the appraiser. The appraiser is trying to establish a value for a property. Now, a home inspector tries to give a condition report. The appraiser kind of does the condition report, but he or she has a bigger job. He's got to determine the economic value of the property. So he's looking at the condition of the property itself. That covers the home inspection, but he's also got to look at comps and the market forces. Right now, appraisers are scared to death. They see the interest rates going up, and they're deathly afraid of, saying a house is worth 500,000, and then, a year from now it sells for 300,000. And they'll say, you overinflated the appraisal. This happened in 2008. This happened in 2000. The appraisers have a pretty thankless job, but they don't work for you. They do not work for the seller. They definitely think they work for the buyer, but their real job is to advise the buyer's bank, because they're telling the bank whether it's worth lending $400,000 on this pile of wood studs. Now, as we think about broadly tonight, we talk about the different perceptions of real estate. Does anybody kind of see the differences here? Of course, we different people. The seller, the buyer, the appraiser thinks it's falling apart. The bank, no, it's too small, or maybe it's very big. I don't know. Inspector thinks again it's falling apart, and of course, the tax assessor thinks it's worth a fortune. Quick reminder of the real estate game as we go through all the different classes, the 20 sections. Now, this is primarily not tonight, but we do think about the seller and the agents getting into that escrow for a purchase agreement and meeting of the minds, which hopefully that at meeting of the minds is when the broker gets paid, right, where his fee can be obtainable. But then title insurance, all these different people get involved. On one side, the title insurance checks the legal status of the property. The lender and the appraiser and the home inspector will also check the physical status of the property. Eventually, they get to the closing, they reimburse the funds, and boom, the seller alienates the property from himself, and the new owner takes the property. Okay, again, construction issues are more complex every year. Building codes have literally increased 100 times in the last 100 years. I am not kidding. The 1916 building code, which is what most of New York City was built under, is a half-inch thick and fits in your back pocket. Okay. Again, regulations protect, obviously, they're rules to try to set minimum standards, protect against man-made and natural problems. I mean, one of the things a lot of architects are looking at very seriously right now is the damage from Hurricane Ian, because every architect knows that Florida has some of the strictest building codes in the United States. And I was very impressed looking at the videos of houses where the doors were right on the beach and shaking like crazy, but they were standing up. Yes, some buildings got destroyed with storm surge. Not very many from the wind, although a lot of roofs got taken off, but that's the nature of regulation. Again, plans and blueprints are a key element of the starting point of any project. You may be selling products, houses. You may sell houses off plan, where people will buy them before they're even built. It was very common at different times in the market. In 2012, for instance, New York City really was dead and nobody built anything for a couple of years. And all of a sudden interest rates dropped a lot. And suddenly, I remember there was one place in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, there were 250 people lined up outside for 12 units that became available. I haven't looked at sales statistics lately, but I do believe because of interest rates, we're going to be seeing some pretty significant drops. And again, clearly the whole work-life and work-live environment in the city has changed. And we're still trying to figure out where that's going to go. Again, plans, what are they there for? You can get them online on records. You can put them in your listings. I actually just sent a couple of plans to an owner last night for listings, and I had to point out actually she had some problems with it, and that if she didn't fix the problems, I might not be able to sell the building. Again, fixing old plans, finding old plans. These is a typical broker listing. Never hurts to grab the old listings. One of the first, I just did some research on a product for a court case I'm advising. I needed to find, the fourth floor. So what did I do? And it was a large apartment building. So what did I do? I just looked at the fifth floor, the D line from 4 was going to be pretty much the same as the D line from 5. So the fifth floor plans I found, and bam, I was in business. So again, little creative research. Other research might be things like these. These are called iCards. These are New York City records. New York City was keeping records since 1901. The Tenement House Commission was there because this city was filthy and deadly. And with that deadliness, and I say that with great emphasis, very sadly, making sure that people had good ventilation for airborne diseases like, no, not COVID, but 100 years before, of course, a relative of COVID known as the Spanish flu or tuberculosis or any number of other airborne diseases as well as waterborne diseases. So these plans have been kept in New York City for a lot of apartments. They're out there. Or you can go down to the building department of any city or town and pull the plans. I always check the last listing first. Somebody might have already done the work for you. Again, when we think about plans, we also think about specifications. Particularly when you're buying off plan, it's very important to think about, what is being done, what is being built here. And so specifications, although there's a lot of aspects to them, this is a whole profession into itself. Again, they will identify things like concrete. Obviously, you're probably not going to care about what concrete is being used, but different costing and types of materials. One of the greatest examples is when somebody wants to, thinks they're getting a really high-end kitchen because the computer renderings, but the text of the specification says, you're not getting a $10,000 range, you're getting a $300 range. Actually, today, you probably say, fine, I'll take it. Another very important document with every building, first thing you should do when you get a listing, well, about the third thing actually, is get the certificate of occupancy to understand, is it a building? I was just advising a lawyer today, and the question was, does this building have a C of O? And the answer was, well, it had a temporary C of O and it expired 2 years ago. So legally, officially, that building is not a building anymore. It's a construction site again. Now, the building was built 20 years ago, so you can imagine the quandary. Again, the court has some procedures for that. I'll leave that to them. But for my client's sake, I jumped to the C of O, found it was temporary, and it was expiring. And it's one of the most important words you'll see is amended, that's good, or the word temporary, another big one, and what the word you want to see, which is final. And they've been doing C of Os for a while. A lot of people say, even the city websites say C of Os have been issued since 1938. That's not true. C of Os were actually, they started issuing them in 1916. And in fact, I dealt lots of buildings from the teens and 20s. And this is actually C of O number 1. Certificate of occupancy number 1 in New York City was issued up in Manhattan at 157th and St. Nicholas, which in 1916 was one of the most very, very nice neighborhoods of New York City at the time. Every market changes. What if I told you 100 years ago, Park Avenue was a slum? Yep. 20 years ago, if anybody's been to the High Line of the Meatpacking District, that area was vile and nasty. Today, if you don't know, the Meatpacking District is the single highest rent district in the world. Okay. This is the world we live in. What is bad is good and good is bad. Things will change. And your job as a salesperson or broker is 1, make the change. 2, identify the change. And C, profit from the change. And again, if you make things better, everybody wins. In fact, the best example I have, I think I mentioned a story in another class of a broker that wanted to sell a house in Bed-Stuy. And the street looked a little rough, but he wanted to make really good sale because the house was just stunning. So what did he do? He didn't fix up the front of his house. He fixed up the front of the entire block. He got the money, gave free plants and trimming and stuff for the entire block. A, he broke the sales record at the time for the area when he sold it very quickly. B, he made a lot of friends. And C, he got a whole bunch of extra work after that. So again, identifying the original history is a good jumping off point to finding value in a building. Anybody recognize this one? I don't know if I showed this in a class recently. This is a C of O for 350 Fifth Avenue. Does anybody know 350 Fifth Avenue? Well, this is a temporary C of O. This building's been on temps for a long time. The temporary right there. We see the T right there? So it's temporary number 11. I've seen buildings with temporary like 150. Again, at 3 months apiece. The big picture is, again, it identifies the floors. Cellar 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 20, and all these different floors, different functions. Up we go a little further. We got all the way up to the tower floor, past 85. And that is, of course, an observatory. That was kind of a unique special use the broker had, the commissioner had to come up with. Anyway, the big picture is this is an example of a piece of paper that even the mighty Empire State Building must have to function. Quick trivia, does anybody know what city the Empire State Building was originally going to be built in? In 1931, the guy, I forget his name, bought the steel. It was going to go to another city and be erected, but instead he got it redirected and sent, because in the beginning of the Depression, and he got it sent to New York, so they built the Empire State Building. Believe it or not, the Empire State Building was about to be built in Cleveland, Ohio. How the mighty will fall. Cleveland was one of the richest cities in the United States in the 1920s. If anybody's been there lately, that ain't the case. Again, as we said earlier, building codes are many. Federal, state, rule, building, zoning. Quick reminder from my other class. Again, what are the 3 things that make value in New York City real estate? Is it location? Nope. It's zoning, zoning, and zoning. Also, fire codes, mechanical codes, electrical, plumbing, and energy conservation. These are all things that affect the dealing. And any one of these messing up can delay your job. I'm trying to sort out a 15-year-old application for a large commercial company, and trying to explain that the building code has changed 2 times since then and about to be 3 times. Is pretty hard for them to understand. Again, building permits. This actually can be permits. A big deal for building permits can be an open problem, and often they can stop a deal from happening. So do keep an eye out for things like open permits, violations, etc. I was advising on a deal last year down in Chinatown. And a 1970s sidewalk violation was about to kill a real estate deal. It was crazy. It took us a month to have somebody find a copy of the violation. But in the interim, I told them, look, I'm analyzing this stuff. It's probably not that bad a deal. I went and looked at the sidewalk. It ain't that bad. I said, go ahead and do the deal. And they made a good, he bought the building, he bought it cheap, and he already made about $2 million on the building. So more power to him. Again, actually, I've got a lot of developers that call me because what they do is, and former students, they try to buy buildings with problems, buildings that have unsafe building declarations or any other crazy thing wrong with them. And if you can clean up the messes that most people don't want to handle, you might be able to make a lot of money. Again, architectural styles, we think quickly about how to describe your building. Can anybody tell me the architectural style of the building they live in or work in? Of course, New York City is the greatest mishmash of styles in the world. We get this modernist tower on top of a 1920s Art Deco, a Hearst building on 57th and 8th. A weird combination, but it's actually quite interesting. Again, history, climate, technology, zoning, design, cost, and maintenance all go into, and many more things go into the factors of why a building is the way it is. Because of architectural styles, you can often identify within a couple of years when a building was built. There was literally books of styles that people would go out and cut and paste how they would want their houses, from Federal to Greek to Italianate, Second Empire, Neo-Grec. That's basically right after the American Civil War, we had a style that was very patriotic. Romanesque, Queen Anne, Renaissance, Beaux-Arts, et cetera, et cetera. And as we look at these different styles, we think about, of course, we've seen them all over. And they're not just single family houses. You might see them on brownstones. We think about all the different parts of architectural styles. There's a little chart in the book. It sounds dumb, but the styles can often become a question. If you're really good, particularly the home inspectors, you've got to understand things like what a mansard roof is, and what the shingle style or a stick style does, and how its various details can take damage. I love this style. There's a lot of these in Forest Hills, for instance, a craftsman style, but they have very unique ways of falling apart. Here's the dirty little secret. The day a building is built, I call the certificate of occupancy a birth certificate, because the day a building is born, it starts to die. So your job is to sell it while she's looking good. Easily. Again, building styles on an urban basis, we think about the Beaux-Arts styles, the classical styles of Park Slope. This was very fashionable in the 1880s, 1890s, when Pax Americana was rising, and there was a lot of patriotism after the Civil War, and that resulted in buildings like the 1870s rows of Park Slope. Conversely, around 1910, the artistic world has always, artistic and politics, believe it or not, had a huge impact on architecture. And in this case, the pastoral movements in England in 1910 resulted in the British styles of Kew Gardens, Queens, Forest Hills, Queens, or hey, if in your Manhattan, does anybody know Pomander Walk or Sniffen Court? They're actually a bunch of tiny little courts all over and a bunch of different places around New York City that you walk, you've got skyscrapers on either side, and you walk in the gate, and all of a sudden you're back like in the 15th century. And they're in the middle of New York City. And Brooklyn has a few too. It's a reminder that understanding and trying to describe architectural styles is an important role for the salesperson to not only understand how to describe it. This is a Renaissance revival, 25-foot wide, 2+ basement brownstone with excellent details in the rusticated base. Well, that's the fancy stuff, and the good broker's going to know that, and you're going to find that out. Or you're going to say, well, it's a red stone building, and it's got stairs. Now, you can imagine which broker I want to work with. So architectural styles do have a big impact on your listing. Again, on the right, these styles from different periods. And this, basic little building up in Maspeth, Queens, hey, it's 1930s. Is that exciting? It's probably 1920s. It's not exciting, but guess what? It's a reliable, sturdy house that's lasted 100 years. And because of that, you got to give a lot of props to the houses that make it that way. Again, another thing we think about in design is the architects, the architectural design leaders, men and women, that are doing a lot of work. Jean Gang is a woman, for instance, just opened Geffen Hall at Lincoln Center. Rosario Candela, this guy from the 1920s, his buildings still command a premium 100 years later of 20 to 30%. So these are things to think about. And public work, of course, New York City, you may not, if you know the history of Paris, Les Miserables, you would know that there were big street fights. Well, actually, there were a bunch of different times the Parisians had street fights and tore up the medieval city that was there. So in the 1860s, Napoleon III just ripped the whole damn city down and rebuilt it with what we see today, the wide boulevards and beautifully symmetrical, similar buildings. And that today was actually, at the time, it was marveled by the world. And in fact, by around 1900, the architectural style of great favor was the Beaux-Arts style. Beaux-Arts was actually an architecture school in the middle of Paris. Again, building styles, you should be able to recognize them visually by age. One of my tricks is the windows. The architecture, the windows often give the clues. This is a 1940s, 1930s, 1940s office building, 1970s, early 80s box, 1990s. You can tell really by the windows. This one's out in front of, over by the building department in Queens. Again, key terms: tenements, railroads, brownstones, landmarks, Art Deco, post-war, international style, postmodern, and green. All of these are architectural styles that have an impact. And as you can see in New York City, we got them all. This building, this picture is a little late because now there's several new towers here that are on par, almost as, as taller, if not a little taller than this building here, which is 432 Park Avenue. Again, what do you do when a building works? Sometimes you gotta, bring the architects and engineers and carpenters in, and maybe the concrete guys, and make a mess. So what do you do when it doesn't quite work? Let's take a look. This was not in New York, it was actually in Indianapolis, but they wanted to expand the building, but it was in the wrong place. So they literally picked it up and moved it. Things to think about. Another quick reminder, as we talk about styles and neighborhoods, know your neighborhoods, understand the broker babble, listen to and read the press. If you're not reading this an hour or two a day, reading The Real Deal, all the different websites that are out there, there's a lot of information. You need to be going to open houses, you need to be going to events, because you've got to A, network, B, hear the lingo. Hold on, my brother's coming. Hey, can we talk later? I'm teaching class. Sorry about that. Again, we think about all the terms that I want you to start learning, as you are wherever you are. This is just Brooklyn. Queens has the same, all the boroughs have their own amounts. And of course, all around the state, you could make your entire career out of just one of these neighborhoods. In fact, I always suggest to people, hey, walk them all. Yeah, I know that sounds crazy. Take an avenue in Manhattan, get up on Saturday morning. I know for a fact I'll be getting up at about 7 o'clock and I'm going to do my stand. I'm a big old guy, but you know something? You got to walk and you got to look and you got to learn. So recently I went, for instance, from downtown Brooklyn, I walked all the way to Chinatown all the way to Chinatown in Sunset Park and Dyker Heights. We call that Chinatown number 3 along 8th Avenue in Brooklyn. I was looking for something for a Chinese client. Conversely, I spent a few years in the South Side, in the center of the city. A couple months ago, I went through Williamsburg and Greenpoint. And then, like I said, Thursday, guy calls up and says, hey, what do you think about this place? And I said, I know that. It's got X, Y, Z. And he's like, wow, you're pretty good. I said, no, I've just been doing this for a while. Your feet are your weapon. Use it, okay? Learn your neighborhoods, and it'll help you move forward. Again, now let's get to the real fun. That was some of the styles and things we think about from the beginning of the chapter. Now let's jump into the engineering mechanicals that go with the building. First and foremost is water. Got to have water to make a house work. In fact, if you're in anywhere, if the water isn't working, you're not going to get a certificate of occupancy. It is a requirement for a C of O, both in New York City or up on a mountain. In some cases, you might, for instance, have a place on a mountain and they might give you a waiver provided that you bring in your own work. Water in. Now, there's actually 2 kinds of water, of course. The water you drink, well, 3 kinds. The water that the runoff, rain runoff, and then number 3, of course, the wastewater. And all of these are becoming much more regulated. Obviously, the water you drink, wells can be tested so you don't get poison. And excuse me, somebody in. And conversely, the rainwater has become a really big issue where cities and states are regulating and actually taxing. New York State, Maryland and New Jersey both tried to set up tax systems based upon the amount of water running off your roof. Both times the politician was thrown out of office for trying to do so. And so back to the fun. We think about, again, a typical house in the exurbs, on a 1 or 2 acre lot, single family house. It might get its well not from a city water, but maybe water comes from a well. Again, this is very simple. The water comes up, gets pumped and used. The waste goes out. No, it darn well better not go out to the river. That's a big no-no. It should go out, the wastewater should go, of course, from the house and filter to a septic tank or a sewer. Now, the water coming in can come from a well, but in much of, for instance, Long Island, many towns get their water from tanks up above, where the city pumps the water up into the tanks at night. And then in the morning, when there used to be a big rush of people going to work in the city or the factories, how the world has changed, the water would rush down to help everybody. And again, these are things that we think about. Each community has a different strategy for supplying the water. And making sure that water is clean is incredibly important. You're going to see some heartbreaking stuff in a minute. Again, 1 to 24 users, we get the local Department of Health oversight. 25 plus, the New York State will get get involved when the Department of Health says it's a community well. So if the water is being used by a bunch of people, it's very important to monitor, not only for cross contamination, your junk went backwards in the pipe and contaminated everybody's water, but also, of course, for general contamination. Again, drillers are licensed by and regulated by New York State, and that was actually a test question once. The sanitary water drillers are licensed and regulated by New York State. And why? Because of the real dangers of pollution. In fact, all over New York City, they have monitoring for it. Protecting wells from harm, of course, one of the things we think about is distance from polluting sources. There's a chart in your book that's kind of weird. It says things like, don't have your well draw water within 100 feet of a cemetery. Ooh. Hi, Grandma. Of course, site location of wells is a big factor in layout. For instance, the well has to be 100 feet from a septic field. That automatically means you can't use septic in high density suburbs. A deep well is considered to be 20 or 22. They might say either one on the test. And the idea is that you're getting water from at least 20 feet deep. At that point, if your water is 20 feet down, it should be anaerobic, which means essentially it doesn't have any live bugs in it. It might have dead bugs, but hopefully not live bugs. And in fact, the water quality affidavit is one of many affidavits that are needed for closing. You get that you get plenty of fresh water coming in from your well certification, and you'll get water certification that your runoff or your wastewater is properly percolating and draining back down. Of course, if the city does test for water, like New York City does, they're testing for a lot of different things. Bacteria, and of course, we've all seen, most people don't realize that one of the best ways of detecting COVID very, very early on in December and January of 2020 was to find out that you could actually find it in the wastewater. In fact, wastewater testing doesn't sound very sexy, but it's really important. Today, one of the big mandatory items that used to be a luxury in houses for a lot of people is significant water filtration systems. This, of course, is a filter, water heater, and pressure tank. And if you know you're a home inspection guy, you recognize that. Hey, Brian, that's a black box on top of the water heater. That's probably an oil-powered water heater with a, looking for the gas line. I'm saying actually it's probably gas powered, but that is an impeller. So it's a medium efficiency water heater. Of course, as we know, we think about the New York State Sanitary Code. Its job is to regulate a lot of different things so you don't contaminate your neighbor. I dealt with a client up in Orange County, and his staff threw all the junk, chemicals from the factory in the water in one town, and that water then ran underground, and it ran in the aquifer system and contaminated houses, the water supply for houses 10 miles away. So this is a big deal. And as we're finding, you may not know this, but we have what's called emerging polluting chemicals. One of the most dangerous polluting emerging what's called forever chemicals that literally stay in the environment and never go away. Well, now there's a report that just came out yesterday, guys, looking out for this, that it may have a very serious impact on performance and fertility. And a new study actually indicated that. And so again, we think about these chemicals we didn't even think were bad 10 years ago. And now we're finding that wonderful Teflon pan, maybe making sure we don't have any babies. I know, a little crazy, but in fact, this is the world we live in today. This is a brutal chart of a reminder of how science, in a good and bad thing, has had an impact in New York City. This is tracing about 200 years of New York City history. Let's read this. On the chart on the left is 30 people per 1,000 people. New York City was having plagues every year, okay? Every year. This stuff, and these plagues made COVID look like nothing, okay? 3 to 5% of the population died every year. Even 9/11 didn't make a blip on the radar compared to what we saw here. And of course, COVID, if you don't know, by the way, the overall mortality statistics were barely altered by the COVID epidemic. And although I got to sit next to my brother-in-law as he died, it's not really fun, but the simple reality is this is the way it's always been. In fact, this is how horrible New York City was back in the day, because you wanted to make sure that your water wasn't contaminated. People would go to we didn't know about sanitation until the 1880s and 90s. And by 1880s, the city was starting to make reports trying to figure out how bad it was. And this is how bad it was. Guys, I don't know if you understand what you're reading here. This was a commentary about how deadly only a single block, in this block between Bayard Park, Mulberry, and Baxter Streets, that's Chinatown today, the late Tenement House Commission counted, I hate to say this, but listen to this carefully, 155 deaths of children in a single year on a single block. Yes, I said that right. 155 dead children on a single year on a single block. The percentage of the total mortality in the block was X, whatever. But again, this is how bad things were. This is why cities and why water regulations are so important. One of the things New York City did do in the first half of the 19th century was to build an amazing aqueduct system. Without this here, the Croton Aqueduct, New York City would have never become what it is today. It's a state park up in Westchester. I'd like to go up there sometime. Wastewater. Again, very quickly, we think about, we go back out to the septic. This is very simply from the book. We think about suburban water containment. What comes up from the well has to be a good 100 feet away from this source of pollution or any other source of pollution. Water goes in the house. The water gets used. The water trickles down. Some settles, goes to the distribution box, spreads out, and absorbs and percolates back down into the ground. That percolation is another potential affidavit. Water coming up, waste going out. If the water isn't percolating carefully, then the polluted and or contaminated water can come to the surface and make humans or even animals sick. Urban wastewater, of course, if you're in a city or a higher density area, which is a good 50 miles out from New York, managing that wastewater can be very important. Of course, the waste going out, and one of the things I was just talking to a client about this week, very sadly, a lot of parts of New York City, and we saw this with Ian, by the way, a lot of flooding. The house went out of flood, and we definitely saw this with Sandy back in 2012. The flooding actually went backwards and went back into the buildings. It was quite interesting to see the impact. But again, most importantly, typically a house will have water coming in an urban setting, a sanitary sewer line going out, and very often they'll have another sewer line for rainwater or storm sewer. And why do you want storm and sanitary to be different? Because you get a really heavy rain and that is going to combine and it gets nasty. But the idea is hopefully the sanitary only goes to the water treatment plants, and the storm sewer is taking the rain runoff and taking it out with less filter. Again, New York City spends a fortune on filtering, as does the whole country. This is actually a great growth business if you guys want a stock tip in a down market. Simple fact is, this is a $7 billion building in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And this building is the Greenpoint sewage treatment plant for North Brooklyn and part of Queens. The city had to spend a fortune. And this $7 billion thing filters the water and does a lot of work on some of the pollution from the unbelievably polluted areas around Greenpoint, Williamsburg, and Newtown. because the Newtown Creek here is a Superfund site, which means it is overseen by the federal government for cleanup. Again, ironically, this $4 to $7 billion building, amazing, really cool, but it doesn't stand a chance. This is constantly being jammed up by baby wipes. Yeah, $7 billion building is completely toasted by baby wipes. Now, what happens if you clean up the water? This is Newtown Creek right there. Now, these aren't all built and they weren't quite built this way, but in fact, there is a massive building spree on what used to be a total wasteland 20 years ago, total wasteland. Today, massive amount of new apartments, Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And of course, look at that view they've got. Wow. Or you might say, ooh, look at the view these guys have. But anyway, of course, and if you haven't noticed, by the way, one of the best things you can do for New York City real estate is take the ferry. Take an hour or two and take the ferry from Long Island City or the Bronx and ride the East River and look at the buildings. You will learn so much about the evolution of New York City real estate. But most importantly, you clean up the water, you clean up the nasty pollutants and the environmental contamination of this site, and surprise, surprise, a couple years later, you can start with proper contamination and cleanup, you can start building multi-billions of dollars of apartments. Many of these projects are currently on hold because of a tax rule, which we'll talk about in the tax class called 421A, which is a state law that gave deductions to brokers, to buyers and developers. But that law is currently in renegotiation and has expired. Okay, back to construction, we think about the energy conservation codes. These codes have the purpose of taking everybody to make sure that the newer buildings, as newer buildings come on and old buildings are renovated, we want to make buildings more efficient. Why? Well, they're cutting off, they're not letting us use gas anymore. We turned off the nuclear reactor for New York City at Indian Point. Might sound like Europe if anybody's listening. And they want to go to be an all-electric city. So they want buildings to be more energy efficient. Although warning, footnote warning as an architect, these super environmentally sealed buildings are over and over becoming much more dangerous because in fact, they're become mold factories. Again, buildings are getting certified to be more energy efficient. If you are a commercial broker, you probably have seen this before. This is what's called a LEED certification. This is a type of, it's actually a marketing gimmick. It's a organization that tries to rate the efficiency of buildings. Now, even they, and I've talked to the people, one of the people who wrote some of the standards, they'll tell you it's not perfect. It doesn't do every building. Sometimes it's a joke, but the idea though of LEED is to try to help people understand that their buildings are more efficient and continue to try to be more environmentally correct, not only in using less power, but also recycling water and any number of other things that minimize a building impact on the environment. Some people think global warming is going to destroy the world. Other people simply think, you know, there's an old Boy Scout saying, leave it better than you found it. And somewhere between those two, the cost of compliance with LEED equivalent laws to make buildings more efficient is adding an incredible amount to the cost of new construction. Some would say in many parts, the LEED regulations are in fact one of the reasons why we have a homeless crisis, because we can't build buildings fast enough. Again, there's two sides to that story. I'm not trying to go one way or the other, but the concept is fundamentally go back to the past. In the past, energy was so expensive that you had to build buildings that were efficient. You had to build, you didn't have air conditioning. So you had to have a building that naturally had airflow that went up on a hot day and went out. Natural chimneys. Does that look familiar? How about a cathedral or a mosque or a temple where you have high domes? Those domes are not for fun. Those domes are for air conditioning. In fact, I was just looking at a 2,300-year-old building. Yes, I'm not kidding. A 2,300-year-old building in Iran. And the Parthian and the Iranian empires have been around for a real long time. And if you live in places as hot as that, you learn to build buildings that have air conditioning. And in fact, some of these 2,000-year-old buildings have towers that vent themselves, creating a natural air conditioning. Again, the goal of energy conservation codes is to look at, well, the real people, the goal currently is to get people to net zero. What net zero is a concept by all the different energy recycling, reusing, better insulation, that the buildings will actually have a net zero impact, where they might create solar panels, use solar panels to recycle energy so efficiently that they, over the course of a year, they take in energy and they actually put some back out. So they're net zero. Again, it's a neat concept. One of the problems, though, is building envelopes. Building the curtain wall or the building envelope of the building is very tricky. Passive solar is one way to do it, where you're orienting the building, for instance, towards the sun or away from the sun to capture or deflect as much energy as you need to. Of course, insulation, mechanical systems, big thing there. Material choices and recycling are all part of green and energy code requirements. Again, building envelope, the curtain wall is critically important. And yes, I'm insane and I run around New York City in the middle of the night when it's 0 degrees Fahrenheit and I take pictures of buildings that are leaking energy. Why? Because I find really funny things. Once you get to the infrared spectrum, the world's a different place. This modern office building from the 1990s downtown, look how it's going crazy. The yellow is where the energy is just blasting through the walls, in different areas. So again, areas that you wouldn't expect. But clearly, this is an example. Newer buildings, even the window mullions have to be better insulated. Older buildings from the 1930s. Now we think of this as energy waste. You can see these buildings super hot. You can see the apartments are so hot inside that the hot air is just kind of coming out the tops of the windows. Well, actually, in the 1920s, after the Spanish flu, totally contrary today, they believed, and fancy buildings bragged, that they were so hot in the wintertime that they would like tropical and the hot air would blow out. And that positive pressure was actually a sign of a great and efficient building. Today, we're the opposite. If you are letting energy out like this, you're considered evil and terrible. And in fact, new buildings will get, or excuse me, older buildings will get multi-million-dollar fines in the near future from New York City by wasting energy. Again, in the 20s, they said, please waste as much energy as you can because that energy is getting rid of the polluted air. Today, we have better ways to clean the air inside. Let's not waste the energy. And these are big factors in energy conservation. Now, this is an example of the curtain wall. This is a building I had to come up and yell at these guys one day because they were corking off and a bunch of plywood blew off the 76th floor. Yeah, think about that. 50 sheets of plywood came from the top of this building and fell down onto Manhattan. 50 sheets of 4 by 8 foot plywood. It's an absolute miracle. Nobody got killed. And it was such a scare. We basically, I was a deputy at in Manhattan at the time. I actually signed a vacate on City Hall. I ordered Mayor Bloomberg out of City Hall because they were in the debris field from the falling plywood. Again, that's the craziness, but what you really see here is literally, and you see this all over the city today, where they're literally clipping on these super well insulated panels to a typical structure. And the goal is, again, these panels are made off site, super engineered, literally just like cars, same software as building cars, and triple insulated, 10 inch of insulation. They are incredibly efficient. So these big, huge towers have some really amazing energy profiles. Now, the idea of energy code, very quickly, 19th century, hey, put on a sweater, get a fireplace. That's kind of Germany today, right? They're screwed over in Europe. I was just texting with my daughter in London a few minutes ago, and my son, even worse, is in northern Scotland. And they are preparing to, not be warm until April. I wish I was kidding, but hey, my last name's Winter, so they better get used to it. But my kids are actually over in Great Britain right now, and they're going to freeze their tails off this year because energy costs have gone crazy. Now, the 20th century, energy became cheaper, oil, gas, electricity, et cetera. So we architects and engineers came up with lots of different gadgets to try to manage a crappy building, not much insulation, but okay, fine. So we'll add some pumps and doohickeys and heaters and whatever. And now with the 21st century, the concept with passive house and energy conservation is, hey, let's design buildings that use the sun, are well insulated, have mechanisms to exchange heat. Instead of putting hot air out the chimney, capture all that heat and then only put a little air out, but still bring fresh air in. In fact, the fresh air coming in is being preheated by the hot air going out. These are the types of evolutions of the energy codes. Again, landmark buildings, hey, what do you do with the old buildings? Well, they're mostly exempt, not all of them, but they do, anytime you do a renovation on an old building, you do have to fix up a lot of the materials. On a house, for instance, you would have the 50% rule where in much of New York State, New York City, you pretty much have to do it no matter what. Again, if you're spending more than 50% of the cost of the building, the whole building must be brought up to the energy code. Today, there are, for new buildings, it is so important to have a building airtight that you actually have what's called a blower door test, where you blow air into the house and you literally track all of the leaks down to a very small amount. And in fact, a new house today is an entire house cannot have more than an equivalent of about a 12 by 12 opening in the entire curtain, which is breathtaking. I actually think it's dangerous, but it's the law. So these are things that brokers have to think about, particularly when people want to renovate. Now, if you're going to be doing commercial, same thing. Office buildings are being threatened with millions of dollars in fines if they are not efficient. This is 1251 here, Avenue of the Americas, and this is 1271. Well, 1251 was, when it was built in 1969, they didn't give a damn about energy efficiency because, hey, single pane windows, almost uninsulated concrete columns, this thing radiates heat, but they did not care because in 1969, this was the headquarters of the Exxon Corporation, also known as Standard Oil, also known as the Rockefellers. They didn't give a darn about energy efficiency. However, now, fast forward 60 years, this building, 50 years, this building has to be renovated. The building next to it, this one right here, they're actually taking off, they had a vacancy, Time Warner collapsed. And so now they are literally peeling off the building, we call it reskinning, and they are replacing the old 1960s curtain wall with a modern one. It's like redressing an old tower. Good news is the structure underneath will last hundreds of years, but you got to replace the glass, every 30 or 50 years. And you probably, as you've all seen around New York City with all the scaffolding, we all know that every 5 years, buildings have to check their facades. If you're in commercial, it's called Local Law 11. And brokerage, you'll hear about this as well. You might be selling a building with scaffolding on the outside of the building, or might be selling an apartment in a building. Well, there's two parts to that. One, the views might be blocked for a year, but two, the building is going to have a really big charge. So if you're buying a condo in a building that hasn't had its facade fixed lately, you might have a common charge coming up of, out of the blue, they'll send you a bill for $20,000 and they'll say, oh, we got to fix the facade of the building. Give me $20,000 on top of your maintenance and your rent. Again, this retrofits. The goal is, of course, to have more efficient buildings. Again, my big problem is these hyper seal buildings are mold factories. I will never forget, I was with Deutsche Bank on 9/11 and 9/12, 9/13, 1 to 2 days later, and it wasn't even hot outside. We did, of course, have two buildings fall right next to us. Deutsche Bank was 200 feet from the South Tower of the World Trade Center. But in only about 2 days, when the electricity was off, the whole building was filled with mold. So it's very important to think about natural versus mechanical ventilation and how it affects things. I'm actually part of an article I'm writing right now for conversion of old office buildings is focused, in fact, on ventilation requirements. This is a good example of a building that was supposedly, it's one of the reasons why I laugh at the green rules. This building was supposed to be the most efficient building in the world. It was the first office building to be LEED Platinum. Well, of course, the designers spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the LEED certification brand on the building, which they had to have. This is important. LEED certification is required not only by building codes, but it's required by large corporations. This became the Bank of America Tower. And Bank of America loves to pretend that it's very environmentally conscious. In fact, they tried, but this is an all glass building. Now, they did everything to get that LEED certification, concrete recycling of the old building, water, geothermal, which I like, good stuff, good mechanical systems, something as simple as going to LED lights or turning off the lights when people aren't in the room. It adds up. You guys may not remember, but 20, 30 years ago, I looked around New York City at night and you could always see the empty floors because all the lights were on all the time. Nobody ever turned off their lights. And now, of course, with motion sensors and stuff, we are, in a good way, people are making buildings more efficient. This particular one, though, was not more efficient because, and although I don't agree with him on everything, the one thing former Mayor de Blasio said correctly was, all glass buildings are never going to be very efficient because glass, although it does have some insulation, it's never as good as a good thick wall of insulation. So this building, they did all these things, but in fact, it was not very efficient. And again, when we think about the curtain walls, this is, again, a lot of work for me as an architect, but as a broker or salesperson, you need to think about, is the building complying with new codes? Is, for instance, in New York City, all new buildings have to have a green roof, a planted roof, or a solar panel roof. If you've seen all the smashed solar panels from Fort Myers, you realize, that's kind of spooky. Again, reminder of how energy codes might change. I'm actually, I worry to death on windy days that some of these solar panels on the roofs are going to get smashed and end up going to the streets. But again, the big picture is we think about buildings, the energy code thinks about buildings as an overall system. Not only the cool spaces and the cool entries, but how thick your walls are, how good the air is. This all goes into design. Hearst Tower, for instance, tried to be energy efficient 20 years ago when they really didn't know as much by having a walkway on the outside instead of the inside. It was actually a hideous waste of space. But this is actually much more common in Europe. If anybody wonders why there aren't many skyscrapers in Europe other than London. Again, green has many aspects to it. Green roofs, all of these are marketing tools. They are not very efficient usually, but the bottom line is we're all trying to find ways to be less dependent on the energy grid. And again, no better place than what's going on in Europe right now to find out. If your government, well, whatever. The point is that making buildings more efficient is very important. Again, site, we also think about, when we're dealing with buildings, we think about drainage and sites. Buildings today are required to prevent water from running off, prevent it from running. This building, this rendering right here, as you'll see in a minute, well, this guy on the right, obviously, he found out why it was an alpine meadow. It was an alpine meadow because the soil was sand. He built his house there. Big storm comes along, and his alpine meadow turns into swamp, and his house falls down the hill. Of course, when we think about the sites, we think about land and curb appeal. I could talk endlessly about this, as you could too. The bottom line is you want to make that first opinion look good, first thing look good, do your planning or whatever works. But these can have an impact. And in fact, the site can cost as much as the building. Green roofs, as I said, are a big thing today. I love them only if the owners make a long-term commitment to maintain them. If the owner does not, and they just ignore it, it will destroy your building. So again, these are things to think about. Urban farming and gardening, you better believe it. Many people are saying, hey, Brian, this is what we can do with all that empty office space. Turn it into gardens. And I tell them, nice thought, except it's New York. Again, green apartments, do they sell? Would you pay more to live in an environmentally conscious apartment? Yes, you would. Particularly corporate investors where you may have a person you're looking for to help them get an apartment, and their, let's say, Swiss or German or French or English company or American company will tell you can only rent an apartment in New York City if it is energy compliant with LEED or something like that. So just like offices, now offices really are guided by LEED much more than residential, but you are seeing high-end residential that wants to pretend and sound like it's environmentally conscious. And with the new laws, the new ones are, but with potential dangers. Again, don't get too crazy on your koi ponds, but things to think about. Again, when we talk about sites and walkways and paths, this is an example of a large development on the west side. We had an open house last week, which I didn't go, shame on me. But this is actually a bunch of very, very tall towers. But actually the water design, 30, 40 years ago, the site would have been an afterthought. They would have put the buildings on and put lots of concrete around it. Today, the layout of the area around the buildings isn't just, there's a lot of factors. It's not just for pretty, lots of trees and shade, but it's actually for managing the water. Again, this building is right on Riverside Drive. It is right next to the Hudson River, it's like right here. But all of the water on this huge site will have to be kept in huge, very, very multi-million-dollar tanks and then slowly filtered down, pumped up all the way to Harlem, to 130th Street filtered, and then only then can that rainwater go out into the Hudson River. So that's an incredible cost that goes, again, the good news is better water. The bad news is it adds a lot of cost to housing. But again, did we clean the Hudson? Yeah. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, a couple of years ago, about 2 whales swam all the way up to the GW Bridge, 2 40-foot tall whales. I say that because my son was rowing out on the Hudson the day before. Again, when we think about floods, flood insurance is a big deal. Obviously, do I have to tell you anybody about this after the most recent hurricane? 2 things. Flood insurance is going to the moon, and much more expensive, and helping. You are required as a salesperson or broker to identify to a buyer if a property needs flood insurance. Now, the seller may not have flood insurance, may not have been required because he owns the building outright, but you need to be able to go to floodsmart.gov or other websites and check every property. Hint, New York City, you can actually go to the DOB website and it'll tell you. But as you can see here, this is Williamsburg, Greenpoint again. I'm picking on Brooklyn a lot. I spent a lot of time dealing with bad, terrible, ugly, and wonderful buildings in this area when I was deputy for Brooklyn for about 4 years. And what I want you to see here is not only in Newtown Creek, but actually other areas where you might not expect it. The flood zones run half a mile inland. That's pretty shocking. And so these people didn't know it. I'll never forget this little, in 2007, they added this little notch. And I had 10 men bring their 100 kids and 10 wives and basically screaming and yelling and crying, "We can't afford it. We can't do this. It's terrible." And the kids running around everywhere. And I said, sorry, it's federal rules that say you must do flood insurance because the federal government, FEMA, of course, pays flood insurance. And as you probably see, flood insurance systems are bankrupt. Private housing also, it's very difficult to get flood insurance in low-lying areas. And there's, sadly, with Florida, this is going to cause an exodus in Florida. A lot of people are not even going to get 1/10 of the money they need to rebuild. We saw this in New York City as well. People took as much as 10 years to rebuild after Sandy. Very interesting stuff. So these are things to think about. Flood, when you're dealing with any house, even remotely near the water, you check the flood maps to find out whether it's going to require flood insurance for the new buyer. If you don't tell them that, that's a very bad problem. Again, back in the day, what did they do? They didn't have the government to bail them out. They didn't whine and cry and say, "I'm a victim, please bail me out." Nope. This was the Brighton Beach Hotel. Brighton Beach Hotel, hey, believe it or not, guys, they had hurricanes back then. In fact, they had some really, really nasty ones, a lot. And if you don't know, by the way, October is the time for hurricanes on the East Coast. So keep an eye out. I think there's one in the Caribbean right now, actually. Not Ian. Anyway, the point is, 1888, this hotel, the Brighton Beach Hotel, had been knocked around by a bunch of hurricanes, and all the sand in front of it had been eroded away. In fact, the water was actually coming underneath the 350-room wooden hotel. So what did they do? 1888, they didn't whine and cry. They put the entire hotel, 350-room wooden hotel, on steel, and they literally pulled it back with a train. They pulled the hotel back, like I think 500 meters. Yes, you see little train tracks? They literally pulled this entire hotel back to get it away from the surf. Wow. Again, in the book, we talk about what I consider, like I said, the most important for New York City properties. 3 things: zoning, zoning, zoning. I just had a client call me today. He told me what the zoning was, and I recognized some of the key elements of it. I said, A, really good. B, I bet you're at 125th and Park. And I can't tell you which direction, but I was off by only 1 block. And he said, "How did you know that?" I said, "Well, I've been doing it for a long time. And most importantly, zoning determines the real value of buildings." I have a listing up in the Bronx right now that I'm selling, and I'm selling for a very, very high price. And people call it, "Brian, it's so expensive. Why is it so high priced?" And I explained to them, it's expensive because it has commercial zoning as well as residential zoning. Now, the owner loves it because, if all goes well, we're going to get her a lot more money, perhaps $500,000 more because of that zoning. And that is where you, when you understand zoning, you can pick out stuff. Props out to Red Sparrow Real Estate. They called me today and they were like, Brian, what do you think of this? And I said, XYZ. And people, I get 3 or 4 calls a day from architects, developers, brokers, and you're more than welcome. If you got a listing, give me a yell. I'll give you a quick review of it. Might help you out. But zoning is everything. The M12 class, if you haven't taken it yet, excuse me, the M10 class on zoning is, I go a lot beyond the book. And that is a class that if you don't, I'll put it up on YouTube because I really got to get it up. Okay, on that note, I want to take a break. Everybody's going to take a break. It's 7:30 already. I'm flying. And during the break, I want you to watch this video. If I can get it to play. Darn it. Uh-oh. Huh. Well, I think I moved the file to the wrong directory. So anyway, we are on a 10-minute break. It's 7:30. We're going to start back up again at 7:40. So everybody chill out and take a break. Anybody got open questions? I've been talking a lot.
Is there any keywords?
Are there keywords? I've given you one keyword code at the beginning already. Okay. 2, you're going to put, everybody should put their name in the chat room. Okay, everybody put your name and number in the chat room. And at the end of the night, you're going to also send those 3 keywords to the school. If you missed one, take a look at the other 2. You might figure it out.
What was the first code that was given? I missed it.
I can tell you, but I'd have to shoot you. No, just kidding. The first one, I'll go ahead and say it's M12D, M12D. M12 is the class name and the first and the letter D.
Thank you.
Sure. So we're all on break for 10 minutes, okay? Again, I hope to make these tapes available on YouTube. After 9 years of doing it, I finally put it up online. I'll let you know where it is in the future. Big picture is structural framing and wood. As you see it in, I believe, 382 in the book, you'll see a very similar diagram of a typical, some of the basic, very basic framing of a wood frame house. A modern house has lots of things going on, but the very, very basic elements are the foundation system, the water drainage around it, the wood framing system, and of course, the roof. Let's take a little look at these parts. We'll start with, again, the footing, which is a very important intersection of the building to the ground. Well, the building also intersects at the sides and you can imagine there might be hilly conditions. So there's lots of things that go around underground. And the basic concept, though, keep the water out. Although of course you can't have a basement in a flood zone, because in a flood, that basement becomes a swimming pool. And so that doesn't mean you can't live in flood zones. It means you have to design so the water passes underneath and goes through. So here we go. We got a footing. We got drainage around the outside. We got a concrete wall. Look at it. And then the slabs, sometimes they're concrete. Older buildings, you'll see wood slabs or just sand down there. Not uncommon. Again, once you get up from the foundation, you'll get to the transition from concrete or stone to cheaper wood. Now, that thermal exchange from concrete to wood is actually a place where a lot of rot happens in older buildings. That's more for the forensics class, so we'll save that for the home inspectors. But the idea, of course, is the wood framing. American wood frame construction is very similar to cardboard. In fact, cardboard, what is it? It's actually perfect engineering. You take a very cheap material, paper, make a cheap connecting material, glue, and attach it in very unique ways, and basic flimsy paper becomes incredibly sometimes strong cardboard. And that lesson there is that American wood frame construction can be both inexpensive and strong. If you keep it dry, then it might last a long time. There are three things that threaten buildings: water, water, and water. Water, of course, coming from, water that comes from the water that comes from the roof. If it doesn't drain off the roof properly, water comes from the underground. The water is swelling up in a flood or in just a rainy day. And of course, water from the inside, which is not only broken pipes and leak in the basement, but also humidity and moisture and condensation. In fact, condensation is probably the worst. I was actually watching some videos of these homeowners that were surviving the new storm, and they were complaining about all the different ways the water was getting inside their houses. Of course, they should have been very happy their houses were still standing, but the simple fact is water does incredible amounts of damage to houses. And I would love to be selling drywall down in Florida this week. I'm working our way up. We talk about that interface of the wood joists, the floor joists that are evenly spaced. Whether it's a floor or a wall, anytime you break that even spacing, just like cardboard or fabric, you have to reinforce around the hole. In this case, around a window, you need a nice solid header that's going to take some of the weight of the building and divert it from around the window so the glass doesn't break. Kind of makes sense. And that diversion and that framing is similar to what you might see in a floor. You'll see it in windows, you'll see it in walls, and you'll also see other reinforcement for lateral loading. It's easy to explain this in hurricane season when we think about corner bracing, so the building doesn't turn over on itself or fall down. Of course, the roof itself, it's all about three things: water, water, and water. So managing, get that water down off the roof. Today can be done in a very cheap way. We look at all the Greek temples and remind ourselves you never see the roof, because the roofs were probably made of wood. I'd say one exception: if anybody's been to Rome, you might have seen the really cool building called the Pantheon. The Pantheon has a 2,000-year-old concrete roof. Yes, they had concrete in the 2nd century BC in Rome. How they do that? Well, they had volcanoes to make the ash to make the concrete work. The Western world forgot how to make concrete for about 1,700 years. Nobody knew how to make it. So you'll see even into the early 20th century, concrete was either not available or too expensive. You'll see rubble walls in older buildings. Again, just like the floors, the roof rafters or trusses are evenly spaced, connected by a diaphragm of either floor panel or roof deck. And that evenly spaced joists connected and tied together by bridging and decking makes for, just like cardboard, a strong but really cheap surface. But just like cardboard, don't get it wet. Again, wall footings starting from the bottom up. Over the years, you might see a newer one with a concrete framing here. Older ones where, again, they didn't have concrete. This is the 1870s. This is a building at Astor and Broadway in Manhattan. They couldn't afford concrete, so they built the foundations out of cheap bricks, which would come down the Hudson from the brick places up in Poughkeepsie and other places. Now, of course, what is the purpose of the wall footing is to make sure that weight of the building spreads out evenly. But sometimes, if the ground underneath pulls away, either by settling or rain or flooding or whatever, the foundation can crack. Settlement cracks, particularly diagonal cracks, again, a lot of details in this one, they can be a death sentence to a building. And with that crack, a buyer cannot get a loan for the building. Imagine you guy, oh, I'll pay you $500,000. Let me go talk to my bank. The home inspector comes out and says, oh yeah, there's a really bad crack on the building. Or actually, maybe the home inspector missed it, but the appraiser finds the big cracks. And the appraiser tells the bank, this is not a financeable property because it is structurally damaged. So that's pretty serious. Wall footing, get that balance, make sure the building sets properly so she doesn't settle. Again, quick reminder, sellers, this is really important. Although the law may change, I was actually advising with the state senator this week regarding seller apartments. This is what's called an occupiable but not habitable space. You can hang out down here. You cannot, in New York City, this is not a habitable room. This is not legally a bedroom. Sellers attach the unit above. Maybe you might have a first floor with rooms down below. Legally, the rooms in the cellar are not bedrooms, okay? In almost all cases, you cannot have, one of the rules is, here's the basic idea. I know this sounds crazy, but this is state law. From the bottom of the window, you need to go straight out, not 3 feet, but 30 feet. If you cannot go 30 feet out from the bottom of the window, I know it sounds crazy, then this is not a habitable room. This is not a bedroom. Do not call, if you call this room a bedroom, you could be risking your license. I had a client once, again, why do we care? Of course, low access is low safety. Yes, they're thinking about changing the laws, but on the other hand, there was a really bad flood last year in September. Literally made world news. My son called me from Scotland about it. And literally again, the floods were so bad, about 12 people were killed in their illegal cellar apartments. Okay, do not rent an illegal cellar apartment. Do not represent a house as having a cellar apartment or even bedrooms in the apartment. It can be a recreation. So this one's okay. This one's first of all, it's too low. But again, it's a residential building. The windows, not tall enough. Okay. They got to be 10% of the floor area and at least 4 feet tall. No good. Ceiling, minimum 8 feet. Some of these pipes are 6 feet. You got a duck to walk around here, but that's okay because this is not being used as a bedroom. Yeah, it's got a futon and a table. This is a recreation space, an occupiable space, not habitable space. Here's the really simple question when you're dealing with an apartment. Answer this question. Can a firefighter get in that window, rescue you, and get out? If the answer is no, it's probably not a legal apartment. Okay, if you represent an apartment like a 1 family as a 2 or 3 family, they will come back and sue your broker for a fortune later on. I'm being asked to do these cases right and left right now. I don't like them and I try to stay away from them. One time I did. I had a broker, had a client. She came into a lot of money, very wealthy young lady, and she's very smart. She was from Sweden. She didn't even know American rules, but she knew, she bought the apartment and it had been sold to her as a 3-bedroom loft in downtown Manhattan. Okay. She had a tough day job. She was a Victoria's Secret supermodel. No, I'm not kidding. I think she still is, although they're not doing much anymore. But she was smart. She got legal advice. The brokers told her it was a 3-bedroom. In fact, the 3 bedrooms were not legal. She technically had a very big, beautiful studio, 0-bedroom apartment. And going from a 3-bedroom to a 0-bedroom, you've lost a lot of value in your property. She got consulted, she got a lawyer, and she sued the broker for misrepresenting the apartment as a 3-bedroom when in fact it was a 0-bedroom. Okay, she got $500,000, partly because of my testimony, because I helped her out. Also, what do we think about illegal places? One, again, New York City just handed out like $300,000 in fine to one building because it had illegal apartments. Now, what would make this illegal here? First of all, well, this might be a basement apartment. Fine, let's call it a basement apartment. But if it were a cellar, even if it's a basement, see these bedrooms? They were added later. They have no windows. Bam, 10,000 fine each. Okay, but more importantly, if that boiler leaks or carbon monoxide leaks out, these people have no natural ventilation. They're dead. Okay, and this happens a lot. So in this case, this room has no light and ventilation. These two rooms have no light and ventilation, and these are bedrooms. So 3 rooms, actually 3 illegal bedrooms, and 1 living room, which was intentionally cut up because that room probably originally had gone way back. So this is an example of things you might see. Now, cellar is more than 50% below grade. So that means if your cellar is 8 feet tall and it's 4'1" under, that's a cellar, and you're almost never allowed to sleep in. Okay, first floor, cellar, basement. Okay, this one right here, for instance, is probably basements. Again, these are 19th century walk-up. Why did they do these walk-ups? Because the ground floor was nasty. Horses and coal and food, etc. Again, the help came in the bottom. The rich person lived up here on the top. Again, wealth, what we call wealth today, or wealth then was, nothing, was barely middle class compared to today. But again, a basement apartment can be legal. A cellar apartment cannot. Okay, so please keep an eye out. Look at the C of O to find out know that if you're selling a 2-family, it's really a 2-family. If it's a 6-family, it's really a 6. Somebody just nailed the other day a 3 that was converted to an 8, and they got $400,000 in fines, which basically means the owner of the building is going to lose the building. Okay, quick reminder, again, example of a wind damage. This was a building I had to deal with in the middle of Brooklyn. Yes, a tornado went through Brooklyn in Dyker Heights. Yes, it went through Bay Ridge and Dyker Heights. In this case, it literally sucked the roof off the building. There were 53 people that had just been smuggled into the country inside the building. They couldn't speak any English. They had what's called a snakehead, a smuggler that had gotten them in, and the city had to take care of them all. Thank goodness nobody got killed. So it was a blessing nobody got killed. But this is a reminder of, literally you can see the structure of the damage. Again, overcrowding is a real risk, and the rules are very strict on this. You're not allowed to have more than 4 unrelated people in an apartment. The reason why, but also you're not supposed to have people in areas like attics. This picture, or one similar to it, there was a man in Brooklyn. It breaks my heart to even think about this. He, in some religions, the young ladies are different, shall we say, than the men. Well, the girls all had to sleep in the attic, and he had 7 daughters, and they had boys, and him and his wife slept on the ground, the lower floor. When the fire hit the attic, which nobody was supposed to be sleeping in at all, sadly, nobody got out. This man had to bury 7 daughters. That's, if you're a father or a mother, that's breathtaking. Anyway, the big picture is overcrowding can be a big factor. Another example, it's illegal, is dormitory layouts. You cannot cut up apartments or anything and do dormitory layouts. We'll talk about more of this in zoning, but these, again, no more than 4 people in the unit, or excuse me, 4 unrelated people. You can have a house with 10 kids. That's the only time where this is going to be legal, but that's for another day. Okay, let's look at some listings that could be illegal and potential problems. Every room, when you talk about a room in a house, and every bedroom has to have light and ventilation, a window. In some rare cases, a skylight can be alternate, but the living room must also have a window. In this case, the living room has no windows, so somebody had cut off the living room. One of these bedrooms, probably this one, this wall was added illegally. Yes. Oh, by the way, guys, yes, pressure walls are illegal. No matter what your broker says, I speak as a guy who helped write the building codes. Pressure walls are illegal in New York City. In fact, a lot of people with rent stabilization got thrown out of their apartments because they put pressure walls in subdivided apartments. It voids your lease. Rent regulated and rent stabilized people, that's a really good way to lose your apartment. Anyway, the big picture is the window should light the living room and the bedroom. Or in this case, there isn't a bedroom. This second bedroom is illegal. This is a good example of an illegal listing. It's legally a 1-family, or it's legally a 1-bedroom. They added a wall to make 2 bedrooms to make more money, but it's illegal. And you as a broker misrepresented, you're going to pay the price. Your broker is going to be fined for you misrepresenting it. Bathrooms and kitchens don't count, but they do need ventilation. Okay, what's a minimum size apartment? Basically, today, 132 square feet, right? Small kitchen and bathroom. That's pretty much the minimum size for a new apartment. Yes, I've seen legal, documented 130-year-old apartments that were 50 square feet, but that ain't today. 150 square feet, living room, light and ventilation. Again, that light and ventilation, everybody was like, oh, who cares about that? And then COVID came along and people realized why they wrote those laws 90 years ago to make sure that every space had light and ventilation. By the way, New York City had one of the earliest building codes in the United States. In fact, New York State didn't even have building codes until the 1950s. Again, typical one bedroom. What's wrong with this? Okay, you have foyer, no problem. Bedroom, kitchen, right? Bedroom, nice bedroom with a window. Living room, nice walkout, plenty of light there. Home office. Is it okay to have that home office? Well, you got to check the C of O. It's got to be listed. But what is somebody going to try to do that? They're going to try to call that what? They're going to try to say that's a second bedroom or a junior 4. Hey guys, there's no such thing as a junior 4. Be very careful on how you word your listings. If you call this a bedroom, somebody buys it, they find out it's not a bedroom, they've just lost $100,000 in value, they're going to sue your broker. This is why you work for a broker and why your broker has to maintain insurance. Okay, because misrepresentations by the broker can cost people money. And therefore they will come back to get that money from you, especially when the market turns down. Everybody wants to sue. Windowless rooms, in very rare cases like this is the old Tenement House Museum. Grandfather. Back in the day, they had windowless bedrooms, like day as in 1880s. But by 1901, the city actually came through and knocked holes in people's walls to let the light pass through. Why did they do that? Well, ventilation. Think about New York City with no air conditioning at 100 degrees in the summer. Now think about it in the winter. Remember, everybody's burning coal and wood and cooking inside, and it's nasty. And oh, by the way, tuberculosis is running rampant. These laws were not meant to protect the poor. The laws were meant to protect, sorry, not to be too class conscious. Many would argue that, again, there's a book called How the Other Half Lived by Jacob Riis, worth looking at. And Riis basically contended all these laws to make things more sanitary were really to protect the rich from the poor. Again, it's not a class commentary, but it's a broad remembering of the history and how these things evolved. Again, a legal 2-bedroom. Living room, 150 square feet, kitchen in the living room. That's called a kitchenette. That's okay. It ventilates through the window. Bedroom, nice. Bedroom 2, nice. And that's a 2-bedroom. That's a big, nice one with a lot of closets. Again, what is not a room? The foyer is not a room. Kitchenette is not a room, of course. Bathrooms don't count as rooms, etc. Okay, quick news. Class attendance. It's 8 o'clock. This is class attendance number 2. No, we're not getting a break, but this is M12E. Everybody got that? Everybody mic on and say yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I need some more.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Why am I doing that? A, to make sure you're alive. B, to make sure you don't miss the code. And also, please, at this time, also, thanks, everybody. Also, please put your name in the chat again also. So name and student ID in the chat. How are we doing on that? I haven't looked yet, actually. Everybody putting their stuff in the chat properly? Patricia, thank you. Dave, thank you. Samantha, bravo. So everybody's taking care of that. Let me mess my screen up a little bit. Here we go. Also, when you do it, Miriam, Neelam, please put your school code as well. Oh, I got you, Miriam, up above. That's cool. Again, I just want to, that helps me with attendance. We got a small class tonight, so it's pretty easy. Okay, moving on, class attendance. Okay, back to that foundations. Let's take a little more detail in that structure. Footings, right? We saw some pictures earlier. Then we could have a block or poured concrete wall. Today, there's lots of innovation. They're doing styrofoam walls. They're doing metal walls, wood walls, you name it. Amazing evolution. Oh, another one is, well, whatever. Anyway, the big picture is the building's got to connect to the ground. And then it's got to be waterproof. The water's got to be carried away because water can build up against the side of a building and crush it. But also we think about the vertical load, the weight of the building gets picked up by the walls, and the floor joists with wood, they don't span very far. So in the middle, they might get picked up by a big girder like this. So the joist might span 12 feet and then get picked up by a big girder and then they span another 12 feet. And that's really inexpensive construction. Again, you can see the joists are tied together by bridging so it doesn't tilt over, and a decking. We dealt with a building at Bedford and North 7th in Williamsburg once. It didn't have the bridging in place. They were under construction, and a hurricane came up the coast, and the entire building, because without the bridging, it wasn't connected properly yet. The entire 4-story building pancaked, literally, in the storm. It became 4-story to -1 story in about 5 seconds. So again, we think about that connection from the concrete at the sill plate. The anchor bolts tie that wood down. It's all about lift. You guys probably know why a plane flies. When wind blows, the wind goes under and lifts, right? Well, it's the same thing with a building. You probably saw some videos of the roofs being ripped off of the building. Well, wind on the top of the building is 25 pounds a square foot. Wind underneath the roof is 75 pounds a square foot lift. So literally the force of lifting is 3 times the force of the wind pushing down. So that's why we think about ties. Again, sometimes foundations can really be crazy, where they'll go underground. Yes, you'll see a lot of this in New York City where people go crazy. This particular one is in London, but there are a lot of these in New York City where people will go, they're not allowed to build up. So they will literally build down. One of my clients is in the 4, or my old client is in the 4 comma club. That means the money he manages, think about this carefully, the money he manages has 4 commas to it. Think of what I just said. How much money do you have if you have 4 commas in the money? Starts with a T. Long story short, this man who manages $10 trillion, well, not $9 trillion now, because they've just lost a ton of money. He couldn't go up in a historic district, so he literally built down underneath the house. Again, underneath can be important. Now, the home inspector will usually look at this, but as a broker or salesperson, you need to identify problems before they happen. In this case, the salesperson went under, or the home inspector went under and looked and saw really crappy, unsafe kind of DIY, do-it-yourself repairs. Yeah, I love this. This was my favorite. The guy he damaged the beam of his house like 30 years before, so he slipped a keg in. And actually, the keg did a great job. It actually held it up for 30 years. But now the new buyer finally is coming in 30 years later, and he sees this. He's like, what the heck is this? What are these crappy repairs? Well, these are going to cost money, and they're going to hurt a sale. So if you can see these, before the buyer's home inspector sees them, you might not lose your deal. So especially in old buildings like in New York City, you really need to get, as a broker or salesperson, a good eye for construction problems. This is a great example. The cellar or the crawl space is one of the biggest examples. Again, slab on grade construction. This is where the building is literally built on the ground. This is a more advanced slab on grade today, where they're actually adding insulation. The energy code, you actually have to not only insulate below or out above and beside, but also below. Today, newer slab on grade buildings, the concrete might just be right on the ground or on the rock or on sand, or it may have, built-in heating systems, et cetera. Now, we'll talk about radon later, and it's very important to manage the space underneath the ground, underneath the concrete slab, because you can have buildup of gases like radon, or you can have erosion where the ground pulls away from underneath. There's a sad example of what happens when the ground underneath gets settled away. In this case, an owner went down to Home Depot on a Friday and got a bunch of contractors and said, hey guys, dig out underneath my cellar. I want to go from 6 feet tall to 8 feet tall so I can have my dental office down below it. Well, somewhere between Yiddish and Spanish, something went very, very wrong. And sadly, the building, I took these pictures, the building settled quite considerably. And in fact, it became an imminent danger. This is a brick. They dug underneath the footings. Instead of 2 or 3 feet at a time like you should, they damaged the building. The entire back of the building settled down because these guys didn't know what they were doing. And I got there. This is what I see. It wasn't a settlement. It was settling. Here's a secret. When it's a verb, it's not good. Again, at this time, I was an architect for the city, and I had to order this building immediately demolished because it was settling. And here's the real kicker. This image here is right here by this door. From this door, there were not one, a 1,200 person middle school, a 800 person yeshiva, and about like a 700 person yeshivet, or whatever you call girls' schools in that faith. And I had all the kids around. Friday afternoon, we had no choice but to demolish the building immediately. The owner couldn't get engineers. He didn't know what he was doing. He was just yelling and screaming. And we said, no, this is an imminent threat. imminent is the key word, and we had to have the building demolished. Again, back to wood frames. This is a great image of what goes underneath and is the bones of residential buildings. Again, you see the vertical studs, the horizontal joists, of course, and the rim plates around the outside, the big headers above, in this case, probably a garage, and you see the rafters up above for the beautiful hip roof that's being installed. And this is pretty impressive carpentry. It's nice work. And as full disclosure, I used to be a trustee for the Carpenters Union in New York City. So it made me definitely have a respect for the trade that is a craft and is very, very high tech. Make it perfectly clear. Tradesmen that build these buildings are not the dumb idiots you might think. They're incredibly skilled people in all of the construction trades, because I tell you guys, buildings today are high tech, and you have to never underestimate the people you're dealing with and understand that the building systems can go very good or very bad. Of course, I talked about hurricanes to hold the roof down, because in a hurricane, the roof wants to fly off by the same principle that airplanes fly. It's called the Bernoulli effect. Again, here's the examples where in a wood frame house, in certain areas, you add just a little steel to get a good reinforcement connection. 1 pound of steel at the right connection adds all the value in the world. The wood does most of the work, but certain times you got to add steel connections. And these connections all around the house, again, where steel interfaces wood, whether it be a steel column, a lolly column, or whatever, or the hurricane clips, that all makes the system work. This is a properly done underpinning, where the guy had a 6-foot cellar, and he wanted to add 2 feet, and he had professionals go around and add a little at a time. They added footings, and now the space is deeper and nicer. This is something you might recommend in certain cases to developers. Again, that rubble stone foundation, this building's 150 years old, but if you're good contractors, you can create value underneath. Again, bearing walls, the idea of that wood transferring weight down to a girder or down the walls to a thing is great. But unfortunately, sometimes things go wrong. And as I said, the 3 things that buildings hate: water, water, water. Okay. Very sadly, this is out in, I think, Brownsville, Brooklyn. What happened here is this is a wood frame house, and the house had been attached to another building in the past that up to the party wall for decades. And the water actually had brick in the walls to try to help for fireproofing, but the brick, it's called a nogging wall. See this pre-1916, and that nogging wall, the bricks got wet, the wood made the wood wet, wood rotted, and literally one night, the entire bearing wall of this building collapsed. Thank goodness nobody got killed. However, they were, of course, vacated. We call them dollhouses because, ironically, this happens a lot. And this dollhouse was quite a tragedy. Again, nobody got killed, but they all had to be vacated. And that's quite sad. Again, back to the framing types of wood. This is a possible test question. Again, the post and beam, this is the old style houses. You'd take the wood and cut the lumber, and you'd fill in the space between the wood with straw or wattle and daub or mortar or whatever, or smaller pieces of wood. That's post and beam from the 19th century, pre-19th century. Mid-19th century, early 20th century, they started using balloon frame. Now, by the 1860s, we had gotten pretty good at cutting lumber, standardized lumber sizes, okay? And with that, the 2x, the 3x, they would cut in the lumber yards in upstate Albany. Albany in 1865 was the largest lumber yard in the world. They basically cut down all of upstate New York. I mean, if you see a map of 1900 with the amount of wood they cut down, they wiped it all out. And not only here, but around the world, around the country. Remember, wood was not only a building material, it was a fuel. So they cut down the Adirondacks were somewhat denuded. I saw some great pictures of mountain ranges that are completely wiped out of trees, which caused erosion, which caused all kinds of other stuff. And it took 100 years to recreate the forest that we see today upstate. And again, balloon framing, 1880s, relatively new lumber, cut carefully, standard sizes. And the idea here was you build the balloon of the house and you hang the floors off of the barn-like balloon frame. If you think balloon, think barn. A big outside frame with the floors hanging off. Now, today, modern construction is, again, we've got a lot of new materials. We've got fasteners, we've got plywood, we've got very standardized lumber. So today we do the house of cards of the platform framing, where you build, again, the joists and the subfloor creates a strong platform, and then you tilt up the walls, and then you build the next deck, and you tilt up the walls, and the platform framing, building that platform and then working on it is a key element of platform framing. And that's almost the only thing they use today. Quickly, we think about roof types. Over the decades and centuries, we saw architectural styles, and roof types varied a lot. Each one of them had their reasons. Gambrel R2X, I've got a debate with a building commissioner about these styles right now. He's not going to give up, but I'm going to win, but only because we both want good things. But again, we see these roof types over the years. This was because the gambrel roofs were because you lived in your attic, and who was on the first floor in the wintertime? A reminder of Europeans, what they're about to go through this winter, and possibly Americans. Your family lived on the attic or second floor during the winter, and your livestock lived on the ground floor. Yeah, that was the way farmers worked. And the Dutch gambrel style that you could still see in Brooklyn in the 19th century was pretty common. Guys, most of Brooklyn, up until by most arguments, I've been told that up until the Civil War, the 1860s, the primary language of Brooklyn was actually Dutch. And this Dutch style roof for the farmers of the Netherlands was very common in Brooklyn. As we know, Brooklyn is, of course, a town in the Netherlands. Shed roofs back in the day, simple buildings, simple roofs to design. Today, they're a lot more popular because they're great solar panels. Yay. Again, a gable roof, very simple roofs, easy to make. The downside, of course, is they might have lift. See that hip roofs, which deflect wind on all sides, they are more popular in areas like Florida. As an architectural style, you'll see them. The hip roofs, again, the wind deflects. Butterfly roofs are flat roofs. The butterfly that Corbusier designed from the 1950s. Ooh, that's for all of you who know who Dua Lipa is. She does a video celebrating a guy named Lautner. Well, that architect, Lautner, was a specialist in butterfly roofs. Of course, this is also the water flow of a typical townhouse. The roof has to tilt just a little to get the water off, either to the center or straight to the back. Different gables, dormers, of course. One of the big challenges today is everybody wants to sneak in an extra floor. So they'll try to build as much as they can through the dormers that come out under the roof. I always remind people that every time you pierce a roof, you've got a leakage problem. Mansard roofs, this is a reminder how taxes impact the building's design. Well, 18th century France, 19th century France, that mansard roof, the cantilever, where you had two floors. This building was 2 floors and then one attic above. Well, I stayed at a hotel in central Paris that actually had mansard roofs that were 5 stories tall. It was a huge angled roof. And I'm like, what the heck is this? And I found out later that the French, if it was under a roof, there was no tax. So building design as a function of green, building design as a function of environment, building design as a function of style, building as design as a resistance to hurricanes, or in this case, building design as a function of tax evasion. It sounds crazy, but it does. It helps you understand. Of course, in New York, we care about things like snow, solar, of course. Green roofs are, again, a big deduction these days. All these factors play in. Again, quick, when we look at roof framing, we think spend a lot of money building some very fancy rafters, but instead of using trusses, but the good side is you actually get, we also look, when we look at a roof, we talk about the overhangs, the importance of getting that water away from the building. That overhang is a very key element. And again, the soffit underneath the house, underneath that overhang is very important for how the building breathes. The frieze and fascia, the fascia is where the gutter goes, getting water away from the building is absolutely critical. So that water hits the roof, rolls down, hits the gutter, and is carried properly away from the house so it doesn't destroy a house. I had to order a house demolished in East New York once. It broke my heart. Recent immigrant guy, he came from, I think he was he was a Bayesian from Barbados. And he bought a house next door, but the lady next to him, she didn't have her gutters right, and her gutters were washing into his house. And he was too nice to complain until his foundation cracked and his building was settling because the water from her gutters was washing onto his yard and it destroyed his building. Crazy stuff. Attic framing, again, quick reminder, houses might have a big truss up there. Now, trusses are great because they stand a long way, they're cheap, easy to install, but you can't use the space. And sometimes that's okay. And again, we think about that attic framing as a breathing element. Very often the attic, like this, is not part of the conditioned environment space of the apartment or of the house. So it is, what you'll see is the air will flow underneath the soffit and up around to vent the attic, because the attic can get really hot in the winter, or hot in the summer and cold in the winter. The idea, of course, is manage the water. The water comes down, hits that gutter, gets carried away. Behind the gutter, again, that fascia plate, its job is to protect the building from water running backwards. Water is weird, you guys. Again, structural elements, we think about concrete and wood. Large apartment buildings can actually be made of wood outside of New York City, because these wood frames, again, the building is not designed to stay up forever. It's designed to stay up forever and long enough for everybody to get out. That's what building codes do. This is a wood building, it's gonna burn, but it's a wood building and it's got actively functioning fire alarms, fire smoke detectors, etc. That if a fire happens, and sprinklers, hopefully the sprinkler will knock it down, or the fire alarms will get everybody out. They can't make it not burn, but they can prevent it from killing people. Again, steel, same thing. Steel's a lot more expensive in New York City. Houses as well as office buildings are frequently made of steel. The joists, effectively, the steel beams here of this school are running in the same way that floor joists or beams would. Of course, larger buildings today are concrete and steel. There's a building on 55th Street. Other things you might come across, concrete buildings like this is called block and plank, where they build the concrete walls. The floors are instead of being cast, they're actually precast off-site and brought in and trucked in. That's a block and plank can be very cheap to put up, and it's good for low-rise housing. It can be as much as 30% cheaper. Alternatively, large buildings in New York City, especially the tallest buildings in the world today, are not only steel. In fact, most of the tallest buildings in the world today are made of concrete structure. And I won't get to the physics of that, but I actually I ran a cement league for 2 years in New York City, helping the legal concrete contractors to build properly. I've been asked to sell a building that's unsafe. The answer is protect yourself. Never forget, whether it be asbestos or lead or structural stability, you've got to make sure you are alert to potential damage. Now, buildings have evolved over the years. Construction has gone from wood, lath, and plaster, where they put the wood strips on and then put plaster on top. This was great in the 19th, early 20th century. And something, it's still great today. Along the way, they would add things like this metal lath in the back. Love the lath because it actually blocks Wi-Fi, which is kind of cool. But of course, drywall is the most, it's pretty easy to work with. It's insanely easy to work with. And it's about 10 times faster to install than the lath. And I say that as I was also a trustee of the Lathers Union in New York City, the guys who do this plaster. And what are you going to do if you're dealing with a house that's under construction? This is bad. This house is not occupiable. Therefore, the buyer may not be able to get a loan. If he wants to pay cash, no problem. But this, I would usually advise a seller, let's get this minimum work done. Let's pull the permits again and get this work tightened up at least so you can sell it so the buyer can get a financeable loan. Okay. Water damage or, mid-renovation sales, he's in trouble. He's going to lose 30% on his sale. Now, as we talked about the energy code, insulation is another very important element of buildings. Of course, these are some thermal imaging of a building in Brooklyn. No insulation, 1880s brownstone, massively insulated 1880s brownstone. The thermal imaging is really remarkable, as you can even take old buildings, add new concepts of energy efficiency, and potentially save a lot of money. But my biggest problem, as I said earlier, 90% of these are going to have mold if they don't do everything right. Again, we think about thermal imaging. Again, this is more technical. Brokers don't have to do this, but you can see literally today where the water is and where the leaks are behind a building. Insulation is there to prevent that. And ideally, when insulation is put in place, you get a nice controlled building envelope, right? You're building a balloon, can't have a hole in the balloon. Well, over time, things like the insulation might settle or rats might get in, all kinds of crazy stuff happens. But the key measurement of insulation is called the R factor. For you technical heads, it's also the U factor. The R factor is resistance to heat loss. The higher the number, the better. Of course, this 5 inches of fiberglass is probably about an R20. It can be used for there's a lot of different types of insulation, as we see in the book. It can be up in the attics. It can be spray-on insulation. Like, again, this guy wearing a mask, spraying on fiberglass, or this lady spraying in cellulose insulation. Yes, that's right. She's insulating her house with old newspapers. Does that work? Yeah, it does actually. In fact, I had a house from 1917. We found out that's how they insulated the damn thing. They crammed newspaper in the cracks. How did I know? We had to open up a wall and we found newspaper clippings from November 1917. That was when they built the darn building. And again, yeah, you can imagine that house was really, really cold all the time because it basically had no insulation. Same thing here. Again, today's newer buildings, we're looking at lots of ways to insulate the conditioned space, which is the habitable rooms below the attic. The attic, usually, depending on how you design, you might not care about heating this at all. But what you don't want to keep, you do want to keep an eye out for something like this when you do a look around of a building. Again, I'm showing you examples of old buildings because there's so many of them in New York. You know, if you're brokering in New York City or doing a salesperson, when you're looking at buildings, making sure it's legal, making sure it's kind of safe. These are big factors. If you're selling new buildings, there aren't many of them in New York City. So you got to be adaptive and understand some of these old things. This is 100-year-old insulation. It is great. It is fantastic. It really does a good job. And it was very cheap. It sits there forever and fills the attic space with dust. And sadly, this is a lightweight rock, kind of a volcanic rock called vermiculite. They find it in old volcanoes in Wyoming, believe it or not, all over the world for years as a great insulator. But unfortunately, vermiculite Wyoming has the highest, had the highest rate of asbestos death of any place in the United States, because vermiculite rock very frequently is also with another rock called chrysotile or asbestos. And when you see these pellet rock insulations, get out of there fast. It's a potentially contaminated area. Again, spray on insulation, new bad. This wasn't allowed for a long time because guess what? Just like that cellulose insulation there, it actually burns. And if you saw what happened recently at a 40-story tower in Chengdu in China, or the 1,200-foot tall tower in Dubai, or sadly, the 20-story Grenfell Tower in London, killing 100+ people, this insulation can burn. Now, that means in New York City, you're not allowed to, in most building codes around the country, you're not allowed to use anything flammable above 75 feet. And because of that, now these can be used in houses, really good insulation, but it has its own set of problems. It can build up mold if it's not put on properly. And very sadly, if this catches on fire, you're going to have a very hard time getting out of the house. And again, insulation was illegal. In fact, the fire department and I vacated a house that used this before it was legal in New York City. And they had sprayed it on, and they sprayed it on really badly, and they didn't have proper fire protection. And we said, excuse me, but nobody's in this house until the stuff gets ripped out. Again, if you want to Google about Grenfell Tower, or just Google burning skyscraper on YouTube, and you'll see a lot of videos of buildings with that insulation catching on fire. Sadly, I do believe there might be quite a few of those buildings in New York City, and New York City is frantically but quietly trying to find out which ones they are. Again, insulation, the idea of having the building envelope, nightmare to heat. No, it's okay, because it's got 10 inches of really thick insulation, more efficient space, and you can do nice spaces as well. Again, things that matter with insulation, we think about vapor barriers, where the cold is going to touch. Warm air touches cold surface and it turns to water. Now, in the wintertime, the cold air is outside, so the warm air on the inside touches the outside window, and of course, you see condensation on your window. In the summertime, the moisture builds up inside your walls, and these are really challenges. That's why insulation and managing the moisture is so important. Again, if you see water damage or some type of water leak in a house you're trying to sell, this is a red flag that might be a big problem for buyers. Now, a friend of mine says, "Oh, don't worry, I paint just before the open house." Yeah, he does. And well, that might hide the water damage for a couple of days. Actually, I like seeing a building right after a rainstorm because you'll find out a lot about the building. Again, types of insulation mentioned in the book. This is almost always a test question. 50 questions, but this is usually one that's it. Types of loose fill we saw sprayed in, big buckets of insulation at a time. Inside the walls, again, horizontally. Again, there's even insulation underneath the slabs these days. In the walls, we have, again, this is sprayed and foamed in place insulation. Loose fill insulation, where it's just, they poke a hole in the wall and they spray in like loose cellulose, just as we saw on the roof. You can see it in the walls as well. Rigid styrofoam was very popular for a while, not as much today, but it's a good way to do insulation. More common fiberglass insulation is the bat insulation that we saw a minute ago. That's the fiberglass insulation. And today, one of the very big ones is people will retrofit houses with outside insulation called EIFS. EIFS is exterior insulation finishing systems. And basically, you're making the outside of your house kind of armored styrofoam. It's, again, that styrofoam panel, great insulation, but you gotta be careful that you don't have water buildup behind it. Accordion insulation is mentioned in the book. I went high in older houses, and it's actually quite popular in Florida today because it doesn't insulate, but it reflects infrared heat. And by reflecting, what does it do? It's resistant to mold because aluminum doesn't mold. UFFI, again, this was a spray-on insulation in the 70s and 80s. It was very popular because, hey, you just sprayed it in. You got an old crappy house like this, had no insulation, poke a few holes in the wall, you spray it in, and man, all of a sudden your house is warm. And for the next 30 years, this UFFI, urea formaldehyde foam insulation, is slowly breaking down and releasing gases, formaldehyde gas in your home, making a lot of people sick. Some people say it gave them cancer. Big picture is not only does it slowly shrink over time, but even worse, it actually, it off gases and it shrinks. So it doesn't even work as an insulator over time. You can see this wall opened up 40 years later, and the foam has shrunk so much that it really isn't insulating anymore because the air goes around. Little reminder, safety, safety, safety. Okay, guys, you might be looking at older houses or newer houses. Reality is, especially a vacant house, you might deal with wildlife. Big, really important, especially up in the attics, because guess what? Mama possum wants to keep her babies warm too. So please be careful when you're looking around houses. Think about that. A friend of mine opened the roof hatch of an attic and he was going to go up into the attic and a raccoon fell on his head. Go figure. Why is the little girl there? Not because she's an animal. Well, maybe, but she's actually putting on another last type of insulation. This is cotton fiber insulation. It's actually old t-shirts and cotton clothing shredded. It's a lot more expensive, but guess what? No off-gassing, really good insulation, and pretty much child-friendly. I had somebody spec this for the child's bedroom once. Okay, mechanical systems. Let's take a quick look. Running a little behind, so I'm going to start going a little faster. I know I'm already going fast. Heating, ventilation, heat pumps, plumbing, electrical, security, and technology. Each one of these is an entire day in the home inspection class. You're more than welcome to, whenever we schedule them, you're more than welcome to sit in on the lectures. But if you want to be a home inspector, you take the classes and you pass the test. But again, you're as a salesperson or broker, if you're enrolled in the school, you'll be more than welcome to sit in. Okay, let's talk about heating systems first. Lots of ways to get heat in buildings. Older buildings, 100 years ago, they didn't have fancy parts. They didn't have electronic sensors and all this stuff. So what did they do? They had a very basic and powerful boiler. This isn't the original boiler. This is a new boiler, but it's connected to super strong 100-year-old steam pipes. So this boiler is boiling water, turning it into steam, sending it up into the house. It goes up into the house. The steam comes into a radiator. Now, you may not know this, but 60 liters of steam, 60 liters of steam becomes 1 ounce of water. Steam carries an immense amount of energy. The energy needed to turn boiling water to boiling steam is huge. And steam systems take advantage of that, where a little steam goes through the pipe and releases an immense amount of energy in a radiator. We know that, of course. And then the steam turns to water and drips back, goes back down the system, comes back up again, gets heated up again. It's a closed system loop. And that water gets turned to steam again, transfers the energy, and goes back around. You're going to see this again later in new systems like refrigerants. It's actually the same thing. Again, how would you recognize this is steam? A, it's got a controller, and B, it's got a little steam vent on the end. And it only has one pipe. Steam comes in, releases all its energy, and water drips back out. What's good? It's very few parts. What's bad? It's potentially dangerous. Alternatively, hot water systems are used in a lot of buildings. This is, again, what is it? It's a hydronic system like steam. It's using water or some kind of or energy transfer chemical to move, in this case, heat around a house. So the boiler does the same thing. Boiler, you can see the combustion inside the tank. The combustion gas goes up and out of the house. You can tell that's not very efficient these days. That's a waste. But the water gets boiled by the combustion. The water goes up here, goes on what's called the manifold. And then with the hot water system, pumps will be told by the thermostat out in the living room, hey, I need some heat. It's 60 degrees here. Turn the pump on until my living room's 78 degrees. Okay. And you can see where each one of these these pumps, which didn't even exist 100 years ago at this small size, newer buildings have these pumps and they can deliver zoned heating in a house. But again, how can you tell the difference? First of all, they've got pumps. Second of all, they have copper pipes that are usually smaller, and B, they have lots of gauges and stuff because they're literally turning on and off for each zone of heat. Boilers, of course, can be a lot of different things, and this can be a big factor in a sale. Does it have an old cranky coal boiler or a relatively newer boiler here? This is a medium efficiency boiler. It's medium efficiency because it has a big metal pipe for hot air going out. Today's new boilers are so efficient that you don't need a metal pipe because the exhaust air is relatively cool. Because so much of the energy is transferred from boiling to the water that's very, very efficient. Today's boilers are about 90% plus efficiency, which is funny. That means 90% of the energy you burn is used. Now, electrical systems, of course, they are kind of a conundrum. They're pretty simple. Oh, by the way, one quick part about, we'll get to the pipes in a minute. Electric system, you just run a wire to it and it creates heat where you need it. What's the problem? Electric systems in New York City, which has the second most expensive electricity in the United States, behind only Honolulu. New York City's electricity is very expensive, and they want us to be only electric. Go figure. But upstate New York, believe it or not, it's actually most houses in Canada and upstate New York are electric because they actually have really, really, really cheap electric up there because of hydroelectric dams up in Canada. A big picture is electric's pretty much the least expensive in upstate New York and the most expensive in the country in New York City. But electricity is also, again, mandatory. It's considered to be green because you're not burning anything in the house. You're transferring energy through electric. Now, there's two ways to do energy. Heating, you can do electric heating, of course, and you're putting electricity in and heat comes out. If you're really technical, you probably know that there's ways to do cooling through straight electric, but the most common way of doing cooling, of course, is an air conditioner. This is a typical apartment unit called a PTAC, packaged thermal air conditioner. They're not very efficient heaters, and they're not very efficient coolers. But the best part is, of course, they are tenant billable, which is why most tenants love electrical heating, or landlords love electrical heating for tenants, because the tenants pay if they want it warm. Again, radiant heating is a good example. As you can see by the thermals, this is where you're running heat inside your floors. And this is, again, a very passive system, but very efficient. You're heating the floor at about 75 degrees, not too hot, barely noticeable. In fact, it feels cool, but over time it heats the room. And if you never heat above 75 or 80, whatever your target is, so you don't waste tons of hot air that rises up to the top. Radiant can be very efficient for that. And is becoming more popular as it becomes safer. Older radiant heating, I've seen radiant heating in Roman times. The Roman baths of Caracalla had radiant heating 2,000 years ago. So this system hasn't changed. Of course, one of the most common and the most common style in New York State, in the single family houses of the suburbs, most common is forced warm air. Now, forced warm air systems will, of course, bring air down from the cellar, in the cellar or lower floor of a house, or perhaps if it's a one level, just somewhere in the house. They'll suck the air in, heat it up, either by combustion, you might have oil or gas here, or electric heaters, and you might get a boost from a heat pump outside, and then that hot air gets circulated through the house. One reminder, though, is, hot air is often very dry, so they might add moisture, and then that hot air blows and gets distributed throughout the house. Then it eventually gets returned, filtered, and reused again. So you want to use about 90% of the air again to circulate it. Again, forced air furnaces are very common. And there's an old oil burner kind of falling apart, rusting. On the right side with forced warm air furnaces, again, the air comes in, gets blown up, it gets filtered, and it gets blown up, heated, and then distributed out to the house. Now, the heat pump on the outside can be either heating or cooling today. The new heat pumps are really amazing. And I told you the new furnaces are 90% efficient. Well, heat pumps use the energy that you spend on the electric pump, but they also get energy from the latent air around it. You're not going to believe this. You ready for this? Heat pumps are up to 500% efficient. For every kilowatt you put in, you might get as much as 500 or 5 kilowatts back in energy efficiency. So heat pumps are really the future And you're going to see split systems a lot more in new houses and new apartments. Again, what is heating and cooling? BTUs, British thermal units. 1 ton of air conditioning is the energy needed to melt 1 ton of ice in 1 day. And that's 12,000 BTUs. What the heck is a BTU? BTU is British thermal units. Okay, Brits, I know. Well, this is actually pretty cool because they figured this out in the 1700s. Okay, like I think it was 1760, I think it's Watt. And he figured out, how do I measure heat? So he said 1 British thermal unit is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 pound of water 1 degree Fahrenheit. Okay, 12,000 BTUs, 24 hours, melts 1 ton in a day. So you'll often hear the term tons of air conditioning. Do you have enough air conditioning in a space? A rule of thumb, 1 ton is good for anywhere between 600 and 1,000 square feet of a house, depending on insulation and a lot of other things. So you hear that term a lot, tons of units. Now, that refrigeration, today, most new buildings are using these electric-only heat pumps. Again, it uses electricity, it compresses refrigerant, goes out to the house and releases it in the house where you want it. Very quickly, this is the refrigeration cycle. That big compressor inside. Outside the house, there's a closed loop of gas, just like there was that cold and it got heated again and sent around. Well, instead of heat, refrigerant uses compression. Now, compression actually creates heat. The idea is you smash a gas so much that it becomes a liquid. That's refrigerant gas called Freon. You may have heard of Freon. That's the older gas. Today it's called R410A or other gases. So the liquid, this super compressed gas is carrying a lot of energy. The energy goes inside of the house. And here's the funny part. The energy now is released inside the house, and that compression decompresses. And as it decompresses, it actually sucks all the energy as it goes from, maybe 1/4-inch pipe to a 24-inch room. That energy then absorbs the heat in the room. That's another way of saying it creates air conditioning. So again, super compressed hot gas creates cold air conditioning. And then it sucks it back, smashes it, and starts the cycle again. That's called the refrigeration cycle. Quick examples of some refrigerants out there, again, heating and or cooling. The blower comes up, pushes it over and out. Fuels are another thing mentioned. Fuels are a big deal. Many of, at least within New York City, in the near future, all buildings must be electric only. No oil is allowed other than backup generators. That's quite interesting. But again, is that a good idea? Well, wait till you get a power outage. We'll find out. Again, fuel prices do fluctuate. So many places use dual fuels, oil and gas. Well, that oil is up about 200% this year, but gas is up about 500%. And we've seen this fluctuation over the years quite a bit. So again, you might have dual fuel systems. Now, the dirtier the fuel, the more pollution. So New York City in particular has cracked down really, really hard on heavily polluting things like coal. Forget it. You're not even allowed to use it at all anymore. I think, obviously some places still use it upstate. In New York City, they banned it completely. They also banned, more recently, about 10 years ago, they banned dirty oils. Number 4 and number 6 oil outside is a dirty oil, and that is not allowed in New York City anymore. In fact, I mentioned this, if I ever see a building like this, I'm not going to buy there because this building hasn't converted their boiler yet. And if they haven't converted their boiler, this building is going to have about $1 million charge to replace the old dirty boiler with a new efficient boiler, which they have to do. If they don't do it, the city will come along and turn their heat off. It's pretty brutal. Why do they do that? Because the 3 neighborhoods that have the highest asthma in the United States were East Harlem, not so wealthy, Astoria, middle class, and the Upper East Side of Manhattan, extremely wealthy. So pollution hated everybody, rich, poor, middle class, everything. And more importantly, the Astoria, in fact, had the highest asthma rates in the United States 20 years ago because of the dirty oil and coal power plants that are on the East River. In fact, I moved out because I had babies and I had to get them away because I found out that Astoria had the highest childhood asthma rate of any place in the United States. So I moved. Things to think about. Today, upstate, you might see wood pellets and propane tanks are frequent in houses as you go further north from New York. Okay, plumbing. This is going to be, instead of the 8-hour version, I'm going to give you a 2-minute version because we all know how to flush a toilet. Well, actually, when you think about plumbing, you got to think, of course, the water coming in and the water going out. But let's follow that water coming in. Water comes in, supply, it could either be from city supply or it could be from your well. It comes in, it probably gets filtered, not shown here. Some of the water goes into the water heater, gets heated up. So you got hot and cold water going out around the house. Hot and cold water goes up to a sink fixture. Of course, when you use the water, now this is all, there's no air in this pipe. Now, once you've used it in the sink, your water is going to go down to drain. Now, the problem is when you flush a toilet or turn water down sink, there's air in these pipes or water in these pipes that has to be moved aside. And to do that, what's absolutely critical is that you have a vent. It's a thing most people never see, but there's a vent stack in the walls. And that vent stack is there because when that water goes down the drain, it is being replaced, or it's replacing air. So the air is being sucked in to take its place. So again, think about your finger over a straw with water in it. If you remove your finger from the top of the straw, the water is going to fall out. And it's the same with plumbing. And in fact, sadly, or actually, or nastily, if that water doesn't drain properly, you're going to have smell. You're going to have water coming up into the fixtures, although there's a trap to prevent the water from coming up. Or also during a storm, the water might come back through your sewer back into your house if you don't have a trap to prevent that from happening. Again, these are crazy things. But again, hot and cold water, each fixture has 4 things: hot and cold water, a waistline, and again, the waistline is connected to the air line or the vent stack that's going to adjust the water level in the drain line as the water drains. One more time: hot, cold, drain, vent. Right here's a trap to try to keep the smell and the water from going backwards into the sink. Types of water heaters. There might be gas or oil, electric. Tankless is becoming a big deal these days. Usually tankless is electric or gas, because what it does is you don't have a water heater anymore. What you have is just a little box on the wall. You start taking a shower. As soon as it turns on, the water comes here, and in about 2 seconds, the water passes over super hot heaters, and those super hot heaters heat the water really fast, called tankless, because you don't need a tank. It'll boil the water as you need it. Now, this isn't as efficient, but it is, because you don't waste time on storing, it becomes more efficient. If you leave your house at 7 a.m., you don't want to be paying to have 80 gallons of water kept warm all day until you get home at 10 p.m. These are things that, again, are part of the design process. So again, we talk about water heaters. Let's look at some very important parts. Now, this is, again, we talk about fail safes. What happens when things go wrong? This is an electric heater. You get to see the hot and cold water coming in and out, heated in here. Now it's going to the water's going to heat up to about 100, let's say 110, 120, and then the thermostat's going to turn it off. Now, what if the thermostat breaks? It's going to heat and heat and heat and heat. It goes past the limit switch, doesn't turn off, and it keeps heating and heating and heating. And at some point, you've got a bomb on your hands. Well, never fear. Each water tank is required to have a TPR, a temperature pressure relief valve. So if the thermostats break and it keeps heating, at a certain point, the TPR is going to switch off and the water is going to burst to the floor. So this is a mechanical defense against explosion. Now, if you've never seen it, the Mythbusters, to show you just how powerful these things are, and hot water boilers even more so, the good old Mythbusters took one of these out into a parking lot in California a few years ago, disabled the pressure relief valve, and heated a 50-gallon water tank. And the thermostats were broken, so it kept heating and heating and heating, and eventually it exploded. The water tank blew 190 feet into the air. Again, you're talking about your water heater is a potential bomb. So this incredibly important safety feature is important. Let's think about the good water heater. How does it work? Of course, it got a cold water supply, comes in the bottom, it passes over the heaters, electric or oil or gas, and then the hot water goes up. Now, you smart people know that over time, water has minerals in it and electrical ionization, and that ionization would make the tank rust. So there's often an element called an anode inside the tank, which actually rusts better than the tank. So this pipe will actually completely rust away, protecting the tank for a few years. Again, plumbing pipes. There's a lot of different pipes out there for different reasons. Sprinklers, oil, gas, water, wastewater, all kinds of different things. Copper, brass, lead, and of course, over time, copper, brass, lead, steel, cast iron, PVCs, plastics have become more common. PVC PEX, I love PEX, really good system for small buildings and houses. And sometimes plastic goes wrong In fact, in the 60s and 70s, there was a huge scandal. Plastic became big. Everybody used plastic, and the system for connections for one of the PVCs failed, costing billions of dollars in damage. Now, as we see, again, know your history. And in New York City, you're dealing with old buildings. Now, we're not talking, I dealt with a building, it was listed as pre-war. It was pre-Civil War. I had another one that was pre-Revolutionary War. You can imagine what these pipes look like after a couple hundred years. Now, lead actually lasts forever. It's an amazing material. In fact, lead has been used since Roman times for water pipes. And we'll talk about that later, but in fact, NASA tries to buy old lead because it's so good for making spaceships. Long story. Galvanized steel was used since about 1900. The price of steel dropped from $1,000 to $10. So we started using steel for everything, including pipes. What's the problem? Steel rusts. Steel rusts from the inside. It ain't pretty. Brass was great until we found out that the brass had poisonous metals in it. Around the 1930s, we finally found enough copper in a couple of huge mines in Arizona, New Peru, and a couple other places around the world. This was actually our secret weapon during World War II. Copper started getting used more commonly. Now, copper ain't cheap. You guys know that, you might know that last year, copper spiked in price. And I was just talking to a broker who told me yesterday, a warehouse she was dealing with in Long Island City, somebody came in and stole all the wiring and all the copper because it's scrappable. Okay, what's not scrappable, luckily, is around the 1960s, they started making boring plastic. Well, guess what? Plastic is pretty good. That's a lot of downsides. We'll talk about that in that home inspection class, but more and more we see plastic being used in piping. 1 to 2 families, you can use plastic in New York City. You cannot use plastic in 3-family and above. In fact, anytime you see plastic in most buildings, it tells me in New York City, it tells me that it's probably illegal work. Again, why does plastic? You go away for the weekend, you come back and your house is frozen. Broken pipes, of course, copper is wonderful, great for carrying water, but don't get it cold. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons why upstate New York, they love electric heating, because it gets cold as hell upstate. Literally, there was a day a couple of weeks or 2 winters ago, my brother called me from NASA and he told me, Brian, congratulations. It's colder in upstate New York than it is on the surface of Mars today. He wasn't kidding. Again, New York State has an extreme range of temperatures. Broken pipes can be a risk, both heating and fixtures. In fairness, that's actually a refrigerator unit, but what we do see in all units, water or liquids generally should only flow one way. In this case, the water comes in, and there's a backflow preventer on a larger building. Very, very important. The water comes in, and once it comes in, it's contaminated. Okay, so it can never go backwards. Sprinklers. Anybody think sprinklers are important? I think sprinklers are very important because A, they save lives. B, they're becoming more and more, they're required for almost all buildings today. Just a little reminder of sprinklers. And notice they all didn't go off. Only the one near the fire went off. Of course, sprinklers are so important. They do save lives, and they're more and more coded, but they're adding to the cost of building buildings. These are things to think about. Oh, hold on. Sorry. Okay, again, you might come across in commercial buildings. A lot of people are building new restaurants today. Sadly, a vast amount of restaurants died in the last 3 years. Good news is a lot of new ones are being built. A lot of some broker friends of mine are basically leasing up a restaurant a week. A lot of new business. So you might, as you're doing residential, you might come across some commercial kitchens as well. These are very regulated in New York City by the fire department. And here's the secret: the fire department, they don't write civil violations like a speeding ticket. When they find something wrong, even something as simple as using the wrong nozzles or the wrong tank size here in this fire suppression, $5,000 criminal violation. You got to go to court with a lawyer to defend yourself. Okay, that was some quick plumbing and fire suppression. Now, quickly, electricity. We think about how electricity comes to your meter. Of course, the meter you got to pay. From the meter, you go to that master switch and service equipment. From there, the wire goes out to a panel box and then out into the branch circuits in your house. You may also go to a secondary or 3 panels, and as the electricity gets moved through the house. Electricity loses strength as it moves through. So you get what's called voltage drop. The shorter the wires, the better. Another very important thing with electricity, you get a lightning strike. or one of these circuits is loose. The electrode is going to transfer that stray voltage down into the ground. My house got hit by lightning when I was a little kid, and luckily the electrode did the job and saved our life. Last question, so keep an eye out for this one. Write these ones down: voltage, amperes, ohms, and watts. Well, this dumb little diagram from the 1920s does a really good job of explaining it. Voltage is the pressure. Everybody knows your typical outlet is 5 volts for a phone, 110 for a regular electric outlet, and maybe 12 for certain lights, and 240 for your big fixtures. Well, that voltage is close to constant, but the actual amount of energy as it starts and moves through the pipe, and that amperage, amperes, this is the actually amount of energy being transferred. So we all know our cell phones, right? Cell phone chargers used to be 5 volts and 0.5 amps. Today, a cell phone charger is 5 volts and 9 amps, or 45 watts. You can charge your phone with and keep your laptop running at the same time. So volts and amps, volts is the pressure, amps is the actual, as the electricity moves through wires, we all know this, electricity always, unless we get superconductors someday, it loses a little energy as it passes through the wires. It goes through the best copper wires, it turns into heat. And that wires heating in the walls can be very dangerous. And that's one of the reasons why we can only have up to 15 amp circuits is that with a typical wire, a 15 amp circuit is going to get up, it won't get hot enough to burn in the walls. 120 volts times 15 amps, that is 180, or excuse me, 1800 watts. 1800 watts, you may know, that's about the biggest hair dryer you're going to find, because that's the amount, 1800 watts is the amount of watts that are in a typical branch circuit. As you can imagine, if wires, you got electricity going full blast, these wires are going to get hot, but the wires are big enough that they're designed to not get that hot and not enough to ignite the walls. Again, today, newer houses that have minimum 100, usually as much as 150, 150 ampere service. Again, the goal of the service is to get it from the house, drop the main panel where it breaks out into small wires, and those branch circuits go around. Each circuit is, 4 or 5 different outlets or lights around the room. Big feature for these things is to make sure they don't have fires. Ground fault, in case you shock yourself, or arc fault, in case the wires get bent or broken inside a wall. Those are 2 very important types of breakers these days. Okay, once, of course, electrical come into the main circuit, broke out to the panel boxes. This is an old fuse box. I love fuses, but it's usually, the fuses are okay, but the wire, because they haven't used this in 60 years, any wire in a fused house is probably old. So you usually have to replace it. Newer panels may, if it's good quality, it will have breakers that work properly. Some old red breakers called Federal Pacific, they actually failed. And again, in New York City's got some of the oldest wiring in the United States. Although, ironically, Buffalo, New York, was the first fully electric city in the United States. Go figure. Again, we talk about how 100 years ago, the cities that were super wealthy, like Buffalo 100 years ago, today, not so much. But as we see, there's types of cables. Plastic, non-metallic, this is just for branch circuits. The SE, the service entrance cable, service entrance, big thick wire that's hanging from the pole, and it is bringing 100 amps of service, the maximum for your whole house. So it is very big wire. And you see, the National Electric Code sets standards by which you can, they can design and you can build pretty standard. Unfortunately, one of the examples of the national codes that became unsafe, but still legal because it's in so many millions of houses, was aluminum wiring. Now, aluminum carries electricity very well, but it gets hot. So they made each aluminum wire a little thicker, but that wasn't enough. And it is argued that aluminum wiring, it's 50 times more likely for your house to burn down. Again, New York Board of Fire Underwriters, this is a state organization, private organization that they're there because they're insurance companies. Insurance companies don't want to pay claims. So they help do research to design safer buildings. Electrical resiliency with people that, you may not have a grid. Alternatively, you have, you got to charge your car. I love the picture the other day of California where a guy was charging his Tesla with a diesel generator on the outside of his house because they ran out of electricity for California. Again, today's solar panels, lots of different energy future is going to be net zero. That same boiler that heats your hot water might also create a couple kilowatts of electricity. Your solar panels on the roof are going to be more efficient. In the future, the windows of your house will be solar panels. In the future, the paint on your walls will be solar panels. Yes, I'm not kidding on that. Again, the trick is electricity is obviously a big challenge, and resiliency is a big deal for clients today. Generac, by the way, this company stock went to the moon this week, as they hadn't had a hurricane in a while. And when the hurricane struck, every Generac mission, we talk about that huge amount of energy created in a power plant, and it travels at very high voltage, which is a lot more efficient. And it travels long distances. And then it slowly, as it gets to your house, they step the voltage down so it goes in your house. So it's traveled AC pretty efficiently. And then when it gets close, it's going to go to DC and go in your house. Again, data security, not part of the test, but definitely a big part of being a broker these days. Houses are computers, and you guys know that already because I'm sure you're on a computer right now. Quick reminder, as we talk about construction, we think about who's doing the work. Home improvement contractors and general contractors are usually city or state licensed, and they're insured. And what they have to hold by state law, again, the general business law of New York State, architects, brokers, contractors all have to have insurance. Again, also, when you do work, when you hire a contractor, you have 3 days to get out of the contract. And again, general contractors cannot really do housework. They can build entire buildings. When you're on the structure, 2 years on the equipment and 6 years on the materials. Why? Because, a little bit of protection for new buildings. In fact, when you buy a house as a broker, you might want to help assemble any existing warranties that the existing seller has. Like he might have paperwork for a 30-year warranty on the roof, or he might have paperwork for the 20-year manufacturer warranty for the boiler. These are all things to assemble. Usually there's not many structural warranties, and that's why if a building settles, the owner, the contractor the state wants the contractor to be held for at least a year for the damage to the structure. Yet another affidavit required at the closing is carbon monoxide and CO detectors. Used to be they just wanted one smoke detector near the bedrooms. Today they want them in the bedrooms as well. Carbon monoxide even more important today, and great news is they're cheap. And even better, they have a 10-year battery. You guys all know this already, but it's an affidavit at the closing, and it can save people's lives. So that's the M12 section. I'm running late, but good news is that the M12B, which is the environmental, we've talked about mostly already. So I just want to take 1 minute break and ask everybody, do you have any questions so far? Covered a lot of stuff, and I've been talking, so I'll give you 10 seconds. Bad news, we're running behind, so I'm going to keep pushing them through. As you know, at the end of the night, you're going to send the 3 codes to slcconference@verizon.net. My email, if you ever want to send me questions or what the hell was Brian talking about, skyscraperfoundry@gmail.com. Let's keep moving. Again, these are some questions we could go through. Quick examples of a question. How about the parts of a roof, the soffit, fascia, and freeze board? These are the overhangs of a roof. The most common system is forced warm air. However, that's changing, but for now, that's the answer you'd probably get on a test. Of course, office buildings, you have to use, or large apartment buildings, you have to use more sophisticated heating. Okay, environmental issues. Let's go through quickly. The book talks about global issues and client fears and longstanding and contemporary issues. Again, environment's a big deal today, both politically and in design. A lot of really, some would say there's a lot of fear mongering. Others would say the world's going to end next year. According to the former vice president, by 2012, New York City was supposed to be under 5 feet of water. I know from fact, because I used to be in charge of the flood maps for New York City, the water has risen exactly 0, okay, in the last 30 years. But that's okay. I'm not saying we don't want to be respectful. Again, taking the politics aside, we think about how it impacts buildings. People want to have more efficient buildings. They want to be off the grid. They don't want to rely on the power. I mean, think about the poor souls that are, out on Fort Myers Beach right now. No water, no heat, no nothing, right? I actually paid for my mother's, I won't get into that, but basically the one thing you need more than anything when the stuff hits the fan is water. And that's, one of the real challenges. But again, what do they do? Wind turbines, and this guy's spraying DDT on the kids. Okay, longstanding issues, the water supply. New York City, for instance, has a fantastic water supply. We do not drink from wells. It is a $10,000 fine to have a drinking supply water well in New York City. Why? Because as I showed you earlier, the deaths caused by waterborne disease were off the charts, 5% per year from waterborne disease in New York City. and it's pretty polluted under, and chances are you're never going to drink the water. Good news is 150 years ago, they set up massive reservoir systems that are pretty clean and get us really good water. That is one of the key elements of New York City. So again, why? Because it's the law. Federal law says the Safe Drinking Water Act, you got to have safe drinking water in the city. No lead, you got to keep that out. We know that went pretty bad for a lot of people. Again, municipal water supplies are tested, as they said. New York State Department of Health reviews the water supplies and checks New York City like every week. Again, water pollution, they're literally discovering new chemicals every day that'll kill us. Health-related issues, testing and remediation. One of the ones I like to remind is the Anacostia River down in Virginia, in Maryland, and in Washington, D.C. It runs through, and they couldn't figure out for years why there were all kinds of hermaphroditic two-headed fish in the water. And what they realized was, of course, later that all the chemicals from military factories over the centuries in DC had just so polluted the Anacostia waterway that the chemicals were actually interfering and preventing the fish from breeding. And we've seen this in humans, of course, where chemicals make people sterile. There was a really nasty chemical in the 1950s that made hundreds of thousands of kids be born without legs and arms. So there's lots of ways that chemicals in the water can have unimaginable effects on humans, animals, etc. I could go there forever, but we're not going to move on. We're going to think about drinking water. Again, naturally occurring threats can be a problem. As you can see in upstate New York, there's all kinds of different minerals because there's Appalachian Mountains under much of New York. Under those Appalachians, surprise, surprise, there's some really fun stuff. What if I told you there is in the salt and evaporite rocks of Western New York, we have vast supplies of natural gas and oil. And yes, they can be turned on very quickly. But the governor of New York decided, the old governor of New York decided there'd be a moratorium. It's not the federal government determines drilling, but New York State says we are declaring a moratorium to prevent drilling for health reasons. And that has stuck for about 9 years, and we'll talk about that later. Again, lots of stuff goes on. New York City, you may not realize it, if you're in New York City, 12,000 years ago, New York City was under, Manhattan was under 1,000 feet of ice. The Hudson River is the bottom of a great glacier. All of the North American ice sheet came down the Hudson River Valley called the Laurentian Glacier. And 12,000 years ago, we were sitting under 1,000 feet of ice. And because of that, much of the soil underneath New York City and all over New York State, you have different conditions because all of New York State was covered in ice, covered with an ice sheet, thousands of feet deep. And with that, the soil underground can be very erratic. In this case, Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, right at the mouth of the Hudson River, although actually the mouth of the Hudson River 12,000 years ago was 50 or 60 miles offshore, but at the mouth of the Hudson River, there's a lot of sand in the ground. In this case, in the middle of the day, rush hour in 2012, 90th Street and 3rd Avenue in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Bay Ridge, Brooklyn is a very dense neighborhood. A 60-foot hole opened up in the middle of the street. This lady luckily didn't fall to fix this problem because they had to stabilize all the sand, which the whole city, this area of the city, one part is sand, 50 feet away, you're dealing with solid rock. So again, we think about that as the subgrades of buildings and how it affects real estate. Again, and making sure the water needs to be clean when we get rid of it. New York City spends the second largest budget in New York City. First is the police. The second is DEP and water treatment. An incredible amount of budget, as we saw earlier, with the $7 billion building. $1 billion building for taking all the sewage of lower Brooklyn. But they do a pretty good job cleaning it because those crazy Garrett's and Beachers, love to death, good people, they actually park their boats right next to a water treatment plant. Very interesting. A little smelly on a rainy day, though. Another long-standing effect, the water coming in, the water going out, and insects. Again, we talked about one of the problems with the insects isn't only the insects, it is the way we get rid of them. Well, in fact, I just was at Hudson Yards the other day, and there is this brand new invasive species that they're warning about. It's got a red spot on its back. And for some reason, I was over by the Javits Center. There were literally thousands of these big bugs just smashing in. I guess they were flying and they smashed into a skyscraper and fell to the ground. So there were literally thousands of them on the ground. at Hudson Yards of this new invasive species. And again, these invasive species are trashing trees. Anyway, back to insects, we think about their damage, trees, bees, ants, etc. Again, how we treat them was sometimes worse. One of the things we used was chlordane, chemical. It's now banned. It kills so well that 30 years later, it's still killing. For all you military heads, that makes it a persistent nerve agent. And sadly, if it'll kill a bird 30 years later, probably going to kill a kid, or it's going to hurt a kid crawling on the floor. So again, these became illegal. They still get used a lot, but there are many kinds of bugs that can be a problem. Of course, as I said, this is a guy in the 1950s, they're spraying DT to get rid of the bugs. But a reminder of termites and their damage. I could go on forever on this. Again, the home inspection class, or New York State has termite inspectors. If you see something even remotely looks like this, make sure that you get the building termite inspected before you start selling it. Because if it's got termites, you're not going to be able to, you're going to spend all your time getting it listed, and it's not going to sell. Tons of termites underneath. Underneath, down in the cellar, you might find this, which is mud tubes, which is basically a termite expressway. Now, the environmental movement in the United States was a large part. Again, we use DDT for everything. This guy down here, he's spraying it in her hair. Is that terrible? Well, you may know that this is actually in Sicily in 1943. Americans invaded Sicily, and unfortunately, there's a big typhoid epidemic. Again, bugs got in hair, lice, etc. Typhus was a big problem. This man was spraying this woman's hair to save her life, and pesticide for a little more evil uses. But in this case, he was saving her life, and they believed it could be used for everything. But then, as you saw, they sprayed DDT everywhere. But anyway, moving forward, around 1962, I think, a lady named Rachel Carson writes a book, and she says, we're using so much pesticide. The pesticide is condensing in the small bugs, and then really condensing in the big bugs, getting even more dense in the small birds, and getting to the big birds. And she believed that, somewhat questionably, some people say it's full of crap, but we didn't take a chance. She wrote a book saying that we would have a silent spring. They were using so much pesticides that we would kill the birds. There would be no songbirds. There would be no songbirds in spring, a silent spring. This beautifully poetic, although scientifically questionable book was an important thing to think about. We don't want to pollute our environment. Leave it better than you found it, right? And it was one of the main kickoffs of the United States environmental movement, and it's somewhat in parallel with larger efforts to use environmentalism as a way to, control countries. Again, in New York City, bed bugs are a big deal. Today, they were gone for 50 years because of DDT. Well, they're back. There used to be a site called Bed Bug Registry. Now you can see bed bug listings on the HPD website. Again, there are affidavits potentially needed for rental or sale. And would you rent an apartment in a bed bug building? I was going to rent an apartment. It had 2 bed bug reports. And I was like, I don't care. And my wife's like, yes, we do. We're not renting there. Today, almost every building has it. It's just the nature of the beast now. Wildlife. Again, reminder again, for safety, wildlife can do damage to buildings. It can do damage to you. And it's definitely something that can be a design element as well as a potential risk, particularly when you're investing or you're inspecting, getting ready to sell vacant units. Be aware that all kinds of wildlife can be a danger. Pigeons, rats, mice, birds, bears, upstate. Yeah, a 200-pound bear in Yonkers. Deer. I saw deer on Staten Island. It means there's everywhere. Possums. Yeah, I caught 2 possums and 7 raccoons in Marine Park, Brooklyn, in my house there. I was dumb enough to put traps out. Coyotes. Yeah, believe it or not, coyotes, 28th and 9th in Midtown Manhattan, over the High Line. They literally come all the way down the train lines. And in 2015, they actually had this is actually 311 data, use data to understand on the outside of the building. Wetlands. Now, wetlands are federally regulated, managed by USDA and local New York State government. They federally designated lands, and if you have low-lying water like this, we used to call them swamps. Today, they're called wetlands. You have to get federal. Most of the time, you cannot build within 100 feet of these at all. A friend of mine he wanted to buy an empty lot out in the Hamptons. I'm like, dude, there's no such thing as an empty lot in the Hamptons. Something's wrong. And he's like, Brian, don't be so negative. I said, no, something's wrong. And sure enough, I look up the wetlands map, and the wetlands map was right to the site. His client would have bought this site for $3 million and then been told, you cannot build on this site. Wow. So again, wetland regulation is very, very big. Goals are good. You want to keep environment, manage pollution, reduce it, clean up the old industrial areas, which are often wetlands. We used to call them swamps, so we polluted the hell out of them. Again, managing that water is critical. Of course, essentially a recreated wetland, pretty cool. Again, that 100-foot buffer zone, it comes from these federal environmental conservation laws. Neat ideas. This guy wanted to build, he wasn't allowed to build in the wetlands. So he said, look, I'll build this really cool building above the wetland, and I'll still let the wetland happen underneath. More plants, water animals, lots of oysters, etc., and then open bay. And of course, Gowanus is one of the most polluted waterways in the world. It is a Superfund also. And for your history buffs, it's also the place for the Battle of Brooklyn, which almost cost America very early its revolution. George Washington got his butt kicked. Again, that water filtering through is this diagram concept of the water filtration is very important, and why wetlands are in Staten Island. Most of the rest of the city, it's just in parks, but sadly, a lot of these areas flooded during Sandy. Again, other materials we think about for in construction, we think about asbestos, lead, radon, indoor air quality, due diligence, storage tanks. These are all factors in the materials going into environmental. Gray pipe there, that's the water running into this house. The water running into this house from the public sewer, from the public main, is coming through a lead pipe. That's lead going to copper, then to the meter, then into the house. Of course, asbestos is a big deal. We know about that. Crystal tile, crystallite, whatever you want to say. Crystal tile is beautiful under a microscope. It is chemically inert. It is gorgeous crystals. Does not, flies up in the air. It's so lightweight, and then gets in your lungs. And I think I got a good chunk of it in my lungs from 9/11. So who knows whether it'll get me or not, but it definitely has gotten a lot of people. Let's take a look. Of course, asbestos was the wonder mineral, legal since 1988. It took them a long time. They knew it was bad, but it was so useful that they blocked making it illegal. Health effects, everybody's heard the stories of from the commercials, because a lot of lawyers are making billions of dollars off these cases, one of which, by the way, was the state assembly speaker, Shelley Silver, who went to jail, but for other reasons. But big picture is asbestos looks like mine. It's a rock, like vermiculite. It's amazing. It's super fire resistant, super insulating, easy to use, easy to spread, and it kills you. Again, testing is required for any new construction. Adds a lot of cost to construction. All these environmental issues all cumulatively have a purpose, but they all add impact to cost in structures. Again, mitigation, how do you clean it up? The asbestos hazardous, whatever, I'll get to that in a minute. There's another federal law that guidelines this. Asbestos was used in everything, okay? And cleaning it up in older homes can be real bare. One of the reasons why I tell people to think very hard and careful about buying older homes is because this contamination, although not really, probably not that harmful, it may be harmful. And no matter whether it's harmful or not, it's gonna cause legal liability to the owners and to the sellers. Asbestos was used for everything. Look at this. This is not a joke. They literally, and I hate to say, I think my mom did this when I was a kid, cleaner onto your tree, Christmas tree snow. I've got a great picture of Julie Garland running through tons of asbestos for one of the movies, for one of the parts of The Wizard of Oz. Again, pipe insulation, roofing materials, siding, window caulk, electrical insulation, ceiling. That whole house is now contaminated forever because she made the tree. And of course they did this because Christmas trees burned a lot. Again, sometimes solving one problem creates a bigger. They put plaster of Paris over the asbestos to protect it, but when the plaster is broken, consider the space contaminated. Again, New York State accredits asbestos contractors. Asbestos management, we think about who has to clean it up. Very complex process. It definitely slows renovations. A lady asked me to do a project. I told her she was going to have to spend 6 months and $1 million to abate the asbestos in her 1920s gorgeous old hotel. A penthouse apartment. She thought I was crazy. She fired me, got somebody else. 6 months later, she calls me back. Hi, the guy didn't know what he was talking. We got a big violation. He walked away. I'm out a lot of money. And can you take the job now? And I said, yeah, but I'm going to charge you twice as much because you disrespect me. Ended up, I gave it to a friend of mine because I didn't want to deal with it because she was a jerk. But that said, use your character analysis is very important. I strongly recommend you get in the habit of trying to be nice and good, but never being afraid to fire a client. Never underestimate how much you can lose from a bad client. Again, the idea of asbestos, like other things, is encapsulation protection possible. Lead, here's another one, really big one. We all know this one, lead paint. Lead is great. It's used in a lot of pipes. It makes water taste good, sits in your blood marrow, and causes the kids to not do so well. And your brain, I think, too. I forget. Big picture is what makes lead dangerous. 11 times longer than a lot of other paints. In fact, Brooklyn was one of the biggest lead paint factories in the world. I have not one, but 3 different clients had lead paint factories that are now a loft, a warehouse, and an elementary school. Yes, an old lead factory, an old lead paint factory is now an elementary school. Talk about mitigation and cleanup. Of course, the sad part is kids wander and they look around, and old lead paint eventually, after a long, long time, chips off. Kids take the chips, put it in their mouth. Apparently it tastes sweet, so they love it. But cleanup can be got to be done carefully. Even lead, as heavy as it is, can go airborne. The Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazardous Reduction Act of 1992 came along. Again, lead's everywhere. All these old buildings have lead. They have asbestos. But the seller, when you are doing a disclosure today, you have to say there's a special form. I think it's on page 404 maybe. And it says, as a disclosure, do you have lead in this building? The owner could say, or the seller could say, no, there's no lead. Well, that's pretty stupid. If it's, let's say, a 1900 building. But if it's 2020, yeah, you put there's no lead. Or you might say, I just don't know. And the buyer has the right to do testing. They both agree to take 10-day period for lead assessment before the purchaser becomes obligated. You can imagine everybody waived these contingencies coming in the last, the big boom of the last years, but it is something to think about. Again, civil penalties. If you're a broker and if the seller, you don't disclose it, the broker and the seller can get in trouble, and pretty big fines if they don't disclose lead to the new buyer. Remember, basically any building built before 1980, assume that you're going to have some lead and asbestos issues. Okay, so these are pretty big things. And one of the reasons why it's so hard to renovate older buildings, as I said, the Dutch boy white lead paint factory in Dumbo, they actually invented the paint can. Again, as we see, it's come off and it chips off. And again, those chips need to be scraped off, mitigated properly, and cleaned up before the new buyer. And of course, that lead also falls to the ground, and it also will contaminate the soil nearby. Now, of course, in water, lead can be just as much of a problem. This is, again, that lead pipe for supply line. I don't care too much about the waste line, where the lead belt trap is coming from a tub and into the waste line of the house. These images are from the middle of Lexington Avenue at 3 o'clock in the morning. Yes, I was working late one night. I came home, and the Starbucks right in front of my house on Lexington Avenue. They were swapping. The plumbers were out in the middle of the street at 3 o'clock in the morning making a racket. They had pulled out from the Starbucks 100 feet of lead pipe and were replacing it with nice new copper shiny pipe, which meant everybody who got a latte there for the last couple of years was drinking lead because there's like a bulb where it connects, because lead is very soft and melts at a low temperature. So they would just kind of torch it and make the connections. Again, lead in soil, see it falls down by the house. The 10-day right to rescind from the buyer. Again, flyer things you have to hand out as a broker for lead. Testing remediation. Again, same thing, move it because it's underneath paint. You got to scrape it, make sure it's even. Every year now, apartment buildings have to do this. And they even have to use a radiation sampler, like a laser gun, to sample how much lead is in the building. Again, lead testing in the water, Safe Drinking Water Act. Of course, we know what happened. We've heard the stories of the city of Flint, Michigan, very sadly with lead contamination. But the reality is New York City was very fortunate because it built its water supply so much earlier than most other places. So we have very little lead in up until the buildings. We often have tons of lead from the entry to the building in. Again, a lead-based solder on copper pipe, that's where you'll see it the most. Again, lead in the environment, we don't worry about this. Again, another chemical is very related to lead, believe it or not, is radon gas. Lead and radon are all related to uranium, very heavy metals that are radioactive. As these metals break down, uranium, thorium, protactinium, whatever, well, these super heavy metals lose a couple of neutrons as they decay, and one of them, at a certain point, uranium, may not realize it, but the core of the Earth is about 4%, I believe 4% uranium. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that uranium slowly breaks down and it becomes gas. And in some parts, particularly in mountainous areas, radon gas is a big, big deal. It's naturally occurring, but it's radioactive. Now, normally it just comes and just filters out in the air. It's very common that the gas can be much more common and also build up. This is a shocking chart. Radon is a very big risk in New York State, another state. The areas near the Appalachians are very, very high radon. Again, you cry and moan about it? No, you put a filter, you detect it, you put a filter in, and you slowly pull the air out from under the house. Gas is very common, not in New York City, because we were underneath the sand of the glacier, but up in the mountains, lots and lots of radon. Indoor air quality, I guess we've all learned about this last couple. You know about that one. Mites, animal dander. My wife will tell you if you had cats within 6 months. She'll tell you within an hour walking into an apartment. Legionnaire's disease, allergens, and air filters. All these factors go into air quality today, and they're big variable for renters. Super quality air. I have an air quality detector I carry with me for clients. Again, we talked about that UFFI installation. Again, this is where industrial chemicals get released into a house. And mold's been around a billion years before us and a billion years after us. But mold, we go down in the basement, you smell the mold, and carpet. Anybody ever puts carpet in the basement, I want to smack them. Thermal image shows it's very hot behind the molding. Take off the molding and wham, tons of black mold. So, what do you do in a case like this? Your first thing you do as a broker, you get a moist cellar, you get the buyer to maybe bring your own, get a dehumidifier running as quickly as possible, and find out where the water's coming from. That's really the key. Again, indoor air and respiratory illnesses. This empty building, and it's loaded with mold. You open the thing and mold with mold. First thing you do is you take pictures, because you don't want the previous broker to blame you, or this listing broker to blame you for the mold. But second of all, he's just going to run away. Now, smart buyer, I almost bought a very moldy house in Terrytown once. It had bad mold, and I offered $210,000 for it. Well, somebody offered $240,000 and got it. Well, he was the smart one. He went in, cleaned up the mold, did a little work, and the next time I see it, the property's on sale on the market for $600,000. So again, mold actually can be a great tool to kill or give you a good discount on a deal. Mold remediation can be very expensive. These guys are, I bet everybody in the United States that does this is on their way to Florida right now. Of course, sick buildings are another factor where people, they go in a house, they can't explain, like the chemical ones we talked earlier. They don't know why it makes them sick. Animals are one of the greatest examples. Allergic allergies to birds, cats. You never know what people are allergic to. But also unknown sources like leaking boiler for carbon monoxide, or chemical fumes from solvents, or any other improperly venting chimney. I almost vacated a large apartment building on Fifth Avenue because they had a leaking chimney and they wouldn't fix it. And I told them, if you don't fix the leak in this apartment, I'm going to vacate your whole building. And they're all like, oh, we're all billionaires, we're going to see you. I said, shut up and fix the leak. And I told them, look, I'll waive the permits, do whatever you got to do, start immediately. And they got it fixed. But if they didn't, I was going to throw them out of the building. And I did that at another building where they didn't do a chimney properly. The chimney, the gas from a chimney next door was going into the house. PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. This is a chemical you'll hear it, wonder material. It's the liquid inside of transformers. GE built lots and lots of transformers upstate, and they dumped lots and lots of transformers are filled with this liquid. They say it causes cancer. Now, this is one of those forever chemicals I talked about earlier. And again, it works its way through fish, etc., and makes a mess. More importantly, from other types of cleanup, there's lots of different industrial pollution in New York State. We've got tons of pollution. State Environmental Quality Review Act and the EPA Act in the United States work very hard to try to clean up messes. First, they identify the agencies, go through the government approves the plan, that 4-stage plan to clean it up. Environmental assessments are needed to try to identify the problem, but these are often used also to try to delay a project. In New York City and state, there are standardized ways of reviewing projects to get things passed. And again, here's a good list in the book of a number of the federal and a few state regulations for cleanup. Environmental impact statements, again, they are there where you've got to describe and analyze what you're going to do and how it's going to impact the environment around you. You got to hire consultants, got comment periods. Here's another big one: Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. What it said is, if you polluted the waterways of Newtown Creek and you own that building, we're going to make you pay for some cleanup. ExxonMobil bought a oil refinery, the very first oil refinery in the country, in the world, I believe, at Greenpoint, Brooklyn, on the Newtown Creek. And they bought it for $50 million and apparently had to spend upwards of $2 billion cleaning up all of the soil, ground, etc., from the 150 years of oil leakage from the Phipps Pratt oil refinery, which had, so some would say there's 50 million gallons of oil in the soil underneath Greenpoint. But anytime you build in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, you've got to do a lot of environmental stuff. Again, quick reminder of all of this Love Canal. The Love Canal was, again, 1950s. They built the houses on top of a cleanup site, and a lot of people got poisoned. When we're dealing with cleanups, we talk about the 4 phases: investigation, testing, cleanup, and management. The cleanup process is very critical for cost. When you're buying a building, you may be delayed by this process by years when you buy a building. And that can be quite challenging. In this case, for several decades, they've been cleaning up Newtown Creek. And now it's still dirty, but actually clean enough that they actually run a free kayak service by one of the developers. Again, super fun. With Sarah, this is again a fund where they take all the money from polluters, put it in a big pool, and use it for emergency repairs. Like they found a radioactive building in Irving Avenue, instant super fun. Lots of different types. I mean, unbelievable amounts of pollution here in New York. Again, in Greenpoint, you don't stop. There's 50 million gallons of oil underneath Greenpoint, but it's still building. The trick is when you're gonna build, you're gonna mitigate, you're gonna put plastic sheet down so the oil's not gonna seep up in your building. But you're gonna realize it's never gonna go away. Another example, similar example, well, that is oil tank cleanup on a small scale. Houses may have oil tanks underneath, and that oil tank could leak. If it leaks, clearly you've got a real, problem. These, 1925 house, the tank is 25-year tank is put underground in 1925. So it's supposed to be replaced 1950, right? Nope. Now it's 2022. Tank's 100 years old and it's rusting like a sieve. So tanks have become a big environmental impact. Also can hurt sales. They may very often have to be cleaned up before. And very often you want to have oil above. And of course, in New York City, they're going to be banning oil. So it kind of gets worse. Again, when you're dealing with old tanks, lots of chemicals, particularly with gasolines and stuff, all fuels really. Again, forever chemicals like MTBEs, and it may not just contaminate around the soil, it may drip further down into the aquifer and contaminate the groundwater. One tank, Mike, as I showed you, as I mentioned earlier with my client, a client I turned down, his building contaminated stuff 5 miles away, and he was a small factory. Again, if you have any leak, there's lots of challenges for that. Tanks are always a problem. This is more specific. Just be aware of it. Again, that phase 1, 2, 3, 4 again. Other types of environmental threats, electromagnetic fields, don't live under a power line. Well, legally, it's no big deal, but many fields are created as electricity flows through wire. And as you can see here, this guy literally lighting fluorescent light tubes just by putting them at the correct angles to the electricity above. Again, New York State, federal government says you can't make it illegal because it really runs through everybody's properties. You can't just turn it off. And so New York State advised people to do prudent avoidance. Okay, look, it's going to run. Just make sure you keep the new houses pretty far away if you can. Prudent avoidance. It's a way of saying, look, again, it's not law, it's advisory. Don't build under a power plant. Of course, in brokerage, you know that if you're under a power line, you're going to lose a lot of value. Today, one of the big threats of EMF, of course, and this is becoming really big deal in real estate. Again, the federal government says there's nothing wrong with it, but cell towers. A lot of people are scared to death. And oh, by the way, especially the cell tower technicians, about the impact of these cell towers. And they're everywhere now. I look out the window, I got one pointing at me from about 2 blocks away. But again, these leases, the buildings can make more money on the antennas than the rent. Very broad law, entire class into itself about all the ways that compliance with accessibility for handicapped or other impaired people, the blind, et cetera, how a business will relate to that. This is a massive lawsuit generated for commercial real estate. And if you're doing commercial, you're going to do a lot of study. Again, see a super great refrigerant that turns outside air into refrigerant inside, 500% efficiency. Well, like everything else, that wonder material, we all know it kills you. Freon, the first and best one, is illegal as we know today. And they believe, some scientists believe, and law says that it kills the ozone layer. Other people say that's a pile of crap. And in fact, they found proof that the ozone layer has been going back and forth for at least 8,000 years, looking at the ice cores. Again, I'm not a scientist, at least for this. It means I can't tell you what your sex is, and I can't tell you whether ozone is important or not, but the law is all we care about. And the law says that And again, they are a potential problem for the environment. Again, yet another wonder material that becomes a killer, or at least they say it became a killer. Again, another quick mention, hydrofracking, probably not on the test, but mentioned in the book. New York State has, as I said earlier, this is the Marcellus Shale. By some estimates, the Marcella and the Utica have as much oil and natural gas as Saudi Arabia. But the belief of if you're fracking at 13,000 feet below ground, you're going to contaminate the water 200 feet below ground. And people don't want to take the chance. So you're not currently allowed to do fracking in New York State, but these guys can frack and they love to sell gas to us. Again, when environmental issues or construction issues, what is the agent's role? Again, there are a lot of affidavits that are required at the sale, and those affidavits have to be in place. You have to be careful what you say about things like structure, and also you have to make sure that the seller coordinates their disclosure forms like asbestos and structure, and make sure all those forms are done properly so that the deal doesn't have problems. Those affidavits are critical for the closing. And again, they can come back and bite you. As I said, if you misrepresent an apartment as a 3-bedroom when it's really a studio with 3 illegal rooms, or you say there's no lead paint and there is, your deal can fall through. Again, contingency, some of those affidavits that might be there at the closing table, lead paint, well-conditioned flow, that's all rolls into the seller property condition report. The PCR is a 6-page report, really worth reading, and you're going to read it a lot because you got to go through it with your clients. And best of all, the last code. Code number 3 for the night, everybody. Da, 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 da. Please put your name in the chat one more time. Name and number in the chat. And there you go, M12F. Send your email to slcconference@verizon.net. Your name and the 3 codes. M12F is the 3rd code. I'm really heavy into crypto, really tough codes tonight, guys. Hope you figured it out. But most importantly, I hope between all my babbling, I hope you got something out of it.